Hello, curious minds. I'm the Cat Nat Storyteller, here to share a tale to keep you company tonight. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, get comfortable and let's dive in. The air was heavy, the kind of weight you feel in your chest when something's wrong, but you can't put your finger on it. Two young men, Lucas and Ezra, stood outside an old gas station on the edge of a fading town, staring at the blinking "Open 24 hours" sign that seemed to buzz louder than it should. They weren't just there for work tonight. They were about to uncover why the town whispered the name Black Hollow with a shudder. "Did you hear that?" Ezra asked, his voice barely louder than the crickets. Lucas shook his head, but the unease in his eyes betrayed him. It wasn't a normal night. Not even close. Lucas leaned against the counter of the gas station convenience store, tapping his pen against a half-filled crossword puzzle. The night was oppressively quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak of the old building sound like a scream. Ezra sat across the counter, sipping on a stale cup of coffee he had grabbed from the diner before his shift ended. "Lucas, tell me again why we thought this town was a good idea," Ezra asked, staring into his cup as if it held the answers. "Because it's cheap, and we're broke," Lucas replied flatly, never looking up from his crossword. "Yeah, well, cheap doesn't cover the weird vibes, man." Ezra glanced toward the window, where the neon "Open 24 hours" sign flickered erratically. Lucas smirked. "Weird vibes? You're just paranoid." "Paranoid?" Ezra scoffed, setting his cup down with a thud. "Tell me it's normal that Mrs. Crowley from the diner talks to the empty booth at the back every night. Or that the sheriff warned me not to take the shortcut through the woods unless I wanted to meet the shadows." Lucas laughed, but it felt hollow. "She's just old, and the sheriff's probably messing with you." Small-town humor. Ezra didn't look convinced. "Humor doesn't explain the scratches on my car last week. I parked it right in front of the diner, and when I came out..." A loud bang cut him off, making them both jump. Lucas instinctively grabbed the flashlight from under the counter and flicked it on. What the hell was that? Ezra got up, peering cautiously toward the front door. The noise had come from outside, but the street beyond the glass doors was empty. The only movement was the dim swaying of the streetlight, casting long, eerie shadows across the asphalt. "Maybe it's an animal," Lucas said, though his grip on the flashlight tightened. Ezra shook his head. That didn't sound like an animal. It sounded heavy. The two exchanged uneasy glances before stepping out into the night. The cold air hit them like a slap, carrying an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. They rounded the corner of the gas station, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. A dumpster sat against the wall, its lid slightly ajar. "See? Probably just a raccoon," Lucas said, though his voice lacked conviction. Ezra nodded, but something about the scene felt off. He approached cautiously, gripping the edge of the dumpster lid. "If it's a raccoon, it's about to have a bad night," he muttered, lifting it. The smell hit them first, acrid and metallic, like rust and decay. "Jesus!" Ezra gagged, stumbling back. Lucas aimed the flashlight inside, his stomach churning as the beam landed on a mess of bloodied feathers and fur. At first, it seemed like some animal had been attacked, but as Lucas leaned in closer, something caught his eye. Scratched into the metal wall of the dumpster, just above the carnage, were the words, "Leave now." Ezra froze. What is this?" Lucas stepped back, his throat dry. "A prank. It's just some sick prank." But the words didn't feel like a prank. They felt like a warning. "Let's go back inside," Ezra said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas nodded, and they hurried back into the gas station, locking the door behind them. The rest of the shift passed in strained silence. Lucas pretended to focus on his crossword while Ezra stared at the window, watching the flickering sign. Every so often, he thought he saw movement in the shadows beyond, but when he blinked, it was gone. As the clock neared midnight, a soft hum filled the air. Lucas looked up, frowning. "Do you hear that?" Ezra nodded slowly. It wasn't coming from the radio, which was already off, or the refrigeration units, which hummed at a lower pitch. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through their bones. Then, the lights flickered. Both of them froze, their eyes darting to the ceiling. The hum grew louder, almost unbearable, before cutting off abruptly, plunging the gas station into silence once again. Lucas reached for his flashlight, but the moment he turned it on, the beam landed on the window, and the figure standing outside. It was tall and motionless, its face obscured by the shadows, but its presence was unmistakable. "Do you see that?" Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. Ezra didn't answer. He was already backing away toward the counter, his shaking hands reaching for the phone. But before he could dial, the figure moved, swiftly, unnaturally, and the lights snapped back on. The figure was gone. Lucas and Ezra stared at each other, their breaths ragged. Neither of them said a word, but they both knew one thing. Whatever was happening in Black Hollow was far from over. The gas station felt smaller than ever, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow that did nothing to ease Lucas and Ezra's fraying nerves. They didn't speak about what they'd seen, or thought they'd seen. But the weight of it lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. Ezra paced the narrow aisles, his fingers twitching with nervous energy. "We should leave. Like, tonight. Pack up and just go." Lucas, sitting stiffly behind the counter, shook his head. "And go where? We barely have enough to cover rent, let alone leave town." Ezra stopped pacing, leaning heavily on a shelf stacked with dusty bags of chips. "I don't care, Lucas. Did you see that thing? It wasn't normal. We can't just act like nothing happened." Lucas opened his mouth to respond but stopped when the bell above the door jingled, breaking the uneasy silence. They both turned sharply. A man stepped inside. He looked ordinary enough, mid-40s, a weather jacket, and a face that seemed worn down by the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. But there was something about his eyes, wide, darting, as if scanning the room for unseen threats. "Evening," the man muttered, nodding at them before wandering toward the back of the store. Ezra leaned in close to Lucas. "Something's off about him." Lucas gave him a warning glance but couldn't shake the same feeling. The man grabbed a bottle of water and approached the counter. As Lucas rang him up, the man's gaze flicked to the window, then back to Lucas. "You boys working here long?" Lucas hesitated. "A few weeks." The man nodded slowly. "You seen it yet?" Ezra, standing a few feet away, stiffened. "Seen what?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the bottle. "If you're lucky, you won't. But if you do, don't let it touch you." "Let what touch us?" Lucas asked, his voice barely steady. The man didn't answer. Instead, he threw a crumpled bill on the counter, grabbed his water, and hurried out the door. Ezra rushed to the window, watching as the man climbed into an old pickup truck and sped off into the night. "What the hell was that about?" Lucas muttered, staring at the crumpled bill on the counter. Before Ezra could answer, the lights flickered again. "No, no, no," Ezra whispered, stepping away from the window. The hum returned, louder this time, vibrating through the floor and into their bones. Lucas grabbed the flashlight again, his hand trembling as he clicked it on. "Stay close," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum. They moved toward the back of the store, where the sound seemed to grow louder. As they reached the stockroom door, it slammed shut on its own, the force rattling the shelves around them. Ezra jumped back. "Nope. Nope. I'm not going in there." Lucas swallowed hard. "We have to. What if it's..." He trailed off, not even sure what he was trying to say. Reluctantly, he pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the oppressive silence. The flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing boxes of inventory stacked haphazardly against the walls. "See?" "Nothing," Lucas said, though his voice was shaky. Ezra wasn't convinced. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes darting around the room. That's when he saw it. In the far corner, half hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a smear of dark red. "Lucas," he whispered, pointing. Lucas aimed the flashlight at the corner, his stomach lurching as the beam illuminated the scene. The wall was streaked with blood, the smears forming strange, jagged symbols that seemed to pulse under the light. "What the hell is that?" Lucas breathed. Ezra took another step forward, but a sudden noise, like a low, guttural growl, froze him in place. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas nodded, his grip tightening on the flashlight. The growl came again, louder this time, and the boxes in the corner shifted slightly, as if something was moving behind them. "We need to go," Ezra said, backing toward the door. But before they could move, the growling stopped, replaced by a chilling, raspy whisper that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. "You shouldn't be here." The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the beam caught a figure crouched behind the boxes. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over sharp bones, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Lucas stumbled back, dropping the flashlight as the creature lunged forward. The room plunged into darkness, and the sound of scraping claws and heavy breathing filled the air. "Run!" Lucas shouted, grabbing Ezra's arm and yanking him out of the stockroom. They slammed the door shut behind them and leaned against it, their chests heaving. "What was that?" Ezra cried, his voice breaking. "I don't know," Lucas said, his hand still gripping the doorknob. But before they could catch their breath, the lights in the main store went out, leaving them in complete darkness. The hum returned, louder and more menacing, as the sound of footsteps echoed through the aisles. Lucas fumbled for his phone, turning on its flashlight just as the footsteps stopped. The beam illuminated the front counter, where the cash register sat open, and the words "You can't leave" carved into the surface. Ezra grabbed Lucas's arm, his voice trembling. "We need to get out of here. Now." Lucas didn't argue. They bolted for the door, but just as they reached it, the bell jingled again. This time, no one came in. Instead, the door refused to budge, as if held shut by an unseen force. Behind them, the sound of footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, growing closer with each passing second. And then, just as the hum reached a deafening pitch, the whisper returned, louder than before. "You belong to us now." Lucas and Ezra turned, their flashlights trembling as they illuminated the aisle behind them. It was empty. But the feeling of being watched was suffocating, and they knew, deep down, that they were no longer alone in Black Hollow. The silence was unbearable, an oppressive force pressing down on Lucas and Ezra as they stood frozen in the darkened gas station. The whisper's chilling words still echoed in their minds, "You belong to us now." Ezra's hand gripped Lucas's arm, his nails digging into his skin. "This can't be real," Ezra whispered, his voice cracking. "Tell me this isn't real." Lucas didn't answer. His flashlight beam jittered across the shelves, the light wobbling with his shaking hands. The oppressive hum had subsided, replaced by the eerie sound of faint whispers that seemed to swirl around them. It was impossible to tell where the voices were coming from. They seemed to emerge from the walls, the air, even from within their own minds. "We need to get out," Lucas finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ezra nodded quickly. "But how?" "The door." Lucas shushed him, holding up a trembling finger. He tilted his head, straining to hear something beyond the whispers. There it was. A soft thump echoed from the stockroom. Then another. And another. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, like someone, or something, pacing back and forth. Ezra took a step back. No. No way. I'm not going back there. Lucas swallowed hard, his throat dry. We don't have a choice. There's no other way out. Ezra's eyes darted around the store, desperate for another option. But the windows were barred, the emergency exit padlocked, and the front door felt as solid as a brick wall when they had tried to open it earlier. Stay close, Lucas whispered, though his voice lacked confidence. Together, they crept toward the stockroom door, every step feeling like an eternity. The air grew colder with each step, their breaths puffing out in small white clouds. When they reached the door, Lucas hesitated, his hand hovering over the knob. The thumping inside had stopped. Ezra grabbed his arm. Wait. What if it's waiting for us? What else can we do? Lucas shot back, his frustration laced with fear. Before Ezra could respond, the door creaked open on its own. Both of them stumbled back, their flashlights pointing into the dark stockroom. The beam illuminated nothing but empty shelves and scattered boxes. It's a trap, Ezra whispered. But Lucas shook his head. We need to see what's in there. If we're going to survive this, we can't just stand around and wait for whatever's happening to come to us. He stepped inside, his heart hammering in his chest. Ezra hesitated, then reluctantly followed, keeping his flashlight aimed at every corner. The stockroom was eerily silent, save for the faint sound of their own breathing. The strange symbols smeared in blood on the wall were gone, as if they'd never been there in the first place. This doesn't make sense, Lucas murmured, his voice trembling. Ezra nudged a box with his foot. What if we imagined it? Maybe we're just stressed, you know. Overtired or... The door slammed shut behind them. Ezra screamed, spinning around and frantically pulling at the handle. No, no, no. Don't do this. Lucas shone his flashlight toward the door, his pulse racing. There was no lock, no visible mechanism keeping it closed, but it wouldn't budge no matter how hard Ezra yanked. Lucas, Ezra's voice trailed off, and Lucas turned to find him staring at the far corner of the room. The flashlight beam trembled as Lucas followed Ezra's gaze. In the corner stood a figure, a boy, no older than 10, dressed in ragged clothes that hung loosely off his gaunt frame. His head was bowed, his dark hair obscuring his face. Who are you? Lucas managed to choke out. The boy didn't move, didn't respond. Ezra grabbed Lucas's arm again, his voice barely audible. We need to go. Now. Before they could move, the boy's head snapped up. His face was wrong. His eyes were completely black, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light from their flashlights. His mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, far too wide, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. The boy spoke, his voice layered and distorted, as though a dozen voices were speaking at once. You're not supposed to be here. Lucas and Ezra stumbled back, their flashlights flickering. The boy took a step forward, his movements jerky and inhuman, as though his joints bent the wrong way. Stay back. Ezra shouted, though his voice was more of a plea than a command. The boy tilted his head, the grin never faltering. You can't leave. The lights in the stockroom began to flicker violently, casting disorienting shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. Suddenly, the boy lunged forward, his speed unnatural. Lucas and Ezra barely had time to react before the lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. The whispers returned, louder this time, surrounding them in a cacophony of indistinct voices. Lucas swung his flashlight wildly, but it wouldn't turn back on. Ezra, he shouted, reaching out blindly. I'm here. Ezra's voice came from somewhere to his left, but it sounded distant, as though he was speaking from the other side of a tunnel. The whispers grew louder, and Lucas felt something cold brush against his arm. He recoiled, stumbling backward into a stack of boxes. Lucas. Ezra's voice was closer now, panicked. I can't see. Lucas shouted, his voice breaking. A sudden, deafening screech filled the room, and for a brief moment, the lights flashed back on. The boy was gone. Instead, the symbols had returned, larger and more grotesque, smeared across every inch of the walls. The screech stopped, replaced by a single, booming voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. You will never leave. The lights went out again, and this time, the darkness felt alive, pressing against their skin like a suffocating force. Lucas reached out, his hand finding Ezra's shoulder. We have to move, he shouted. But before they could take another step, the ground beneath them seemed to vanish, and they were falling, plunging into an endless void. The last thing Lucas heard was Ezra's scream, echoing into the abyss. The darkness swallowed Lucas whole, a void so complete it felt as though it were wrapping itself around him like a living, breathing entity. He couldn't tell how long he'd been falling, or if he was even falling at all. The sensation was disorienting, his mind struggling to reconcile the absence of sight, sound, and even the air around him. Suddenly, his feet hit solid ground. The impact jolted him, but it was as if the surface beneath him had softened at the last second, absorbing most of the force. His legs trembled as he tried to regain his footing. Ezra? His voice barely broke the oppressive silence. There was no reply. Lucas fumbled in his pocket for his phone, his hands shaking. He pressed the power button, hoping for the faintest light. The screen flickered weakly, casting a dim glow around him. The scene was worse than he could have imagined. He was standing in what looked like a cavern, the walls pulsing as though alive. They were slick with a dark, oozing substance that dripped in slow rivulets to the uneven ground. The air was thick and acrid, the smell of decay so overpowering it made Lucas gag. Ezra, he called again, louder this time. A faint sound answered him, a low, guttural groan that sent chills racing down his spine. It was coming from deeper within the cavern. Lucas hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to run in the opposite direction, but the thought of leaving Ezra behind was worse than the fear gnawing at him. He moved forward, the faint light from his phone barely illuminating the path ahead. The cavern twisted and turned like a labyrinth, the walls seeming to close in the further he went. The groan came again, louder this time, accompanied by a wet, squelching sound. Ezra, is that you? Lucas's voice trembled. The groaning stopped. Then, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, Lucas. It was Ezra's voice, but it sounded wrong, strained and distant, as if coming from somewhere far away or through a thick layer of static. Ezra. Lucas broke into a run, his heart pounding as he followed the voice. The path led him to a wide chamber, the cavern opening up into a massive space. The walls here were covered in more of the strange symbols, glowing faintly with an eerie red light. In the center of the room was a figure, hunched over and barely recognizable. Ezra! Lucas shouted, rushing forward. Ezra turned slowly, his movements unnatural and jerky. His face was pale, his eyes wide and bloodshot. There was something dark smeared across his mouth, and his hands were trembling as they clutched at his chest. Lucas, Ezra's voice was barely a whisper, his lips forming the words slowly. Lucas froze. Something was very, very wrong. What happened to you? Are you hurt? Lucas asked, inching closer. Ezra didn't respond. Instead, he let out a low, guttural laugh that echoed through the chamber. Ezra? Lucas's voice broke. Ezra's head snapped up, his mouth splitting into an unnatural grin. His teeth were stained red, and his eyes were completely black, just like the boy's. You shouldn't have come here, Ezra said, his voice layered with something inhuman, like multiple people speaking at once. Lucas stumbled back, his phone shaking in his hand. What's happening to you? What is this place? Ezra tilted his head, his grin widening. It's home. And now, it's yours too. Before Lucas could react, the ground beneath him began to tremble. The walls pulsed more violently, the glowing symbols flashing brighter. A deep, guttural roar reverberated through the chamber, shaking Lucas to his core. Ezra took a step toward him, his movements unnatural and jerky. "You can't leave, Lucas. None of us can." Lucas backed away, his heart racing. "You're not Ezra. This isn't you." Ezra laughed, a sound so chilling it felt like ice in Lucas's veins. Ezra was weak. But he served his purpose. "Now, it's your turn." The roar grew louder, and the ground split open beneath them, revealing a swirling pit of darkness. From the pit emerged long, shadowy tendrils, writhing and reaching for Lucas. He turned to run, but the tendrils were too fast. One of them wrapped around his ankle, pulling him to the ground. He screamed, clawing at the rocky surface, but the tendrils' grip was unrelenting. Ezra stood over him, watching with that same eerie grin. "Don't fight it. It's easier if you don't." "No!" Lucas shouted, kicking at the tendril with all his strength. He managed to free himself, scrambling to his feet and running toward the nearest tunnel. The tendrils lashed out behind him, slamming into the walls and floor as they chased him. The tunnel twisted and turned, the glowing symbols lighting his path. The roar and whispers followed him, growing louder with every step. Just when he thought he couldn't run any further, he saw it, a faint light at the end of the tunnel. "Please," Lucas whispered, his voice shaking. "Let this be real." He burst through the opening, collapsing onto a cold, hard surface. The light was blinding after the oppressive darkness, and it took him a moment to realize where he was. He was back in the gas station. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, the shelves neat and orderly as if nothing had happened. Lucas staggered to his feet, his chest heaving. "Ezra!" he shouted, spinning around. But the station was empty. The front door was open, the cool night air wafting in. Lucas stumbled toward it, desperate to escape. As he stepped outside, he froze. The town was silent, the streets empty. The buildings loomed over him, their windows dark and uninviting. The air felt heavy, as if the town itself was holding its breath. And then he saw it. Standing in the middle of the street was Ezra, or what was left of him. His body was motionless, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and his mouth twisted into that same haunting grin. Lucas took a step back, his blood running cold. "You'll come back," Ezra said, his voice echoing through the empty streets. "You always do." Before Lucas could respond, the streetlights flickered and went out, plunging the town into darkness once again. Lucas stood frozen, his breaths coming in shallow gasps as darkness engulfed the streets. The faint glow of Ezra's eyes remained in the blackness, piercing through the void like two burning embers. Lucas felt a suffocating presence around him, as though the air itself had turned against him. "Ezra," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" There was no response, only the sound of the wind picking up, howling through the empty streets like a mourning wail. Then came the laughter, low and guttural, reverberating from every direction. Lucas turned sharply, his eyes darting around, but there was nothing. The laughter grew louder, more menacing, until it transformed into a series of distorted voices, each overlapping the other in a chaotic symphony of madness. "Come with me, Lucas." The voice was unmistakably Ezra's, but it carried an unnatural resonance that sent chills down Lucas's spine. He took a cautious step backward, only to feel the cold, jagged edge of something sharp pressing against his back. He spun around, his heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the empty street stretching endlessly into the dark. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled. Cracks began to spiderweb across the asphalt, glowing with an eerie red light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The air grew hotter, the acrid stench of sulfur filling his nostrils. Lucas stumbled back, his mind racing. He had to find a way out of this nightmare. His legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to move, breaking into a frantic run down the nearest alley. The alley was narrow and claustrophobic, the walls on either side oozing with the same dark substance he'd seen in the cavern. The ground squelched beneath his feet, and with every step, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Lucas, don't leave us." He clenched his fists, trying to block out the voices. They sounded like Ezra, but also like someone, or something, else. He turned a corner and froze. The alley ended in a dead end, but what caught his attention was the figure standing at the far end. It was a woman, her long black hair hanging in tangled strands over her face. Her dress was torn and stained, and her bare feet stood in a puddle of that same oozing substance. Who are you?" Lucas stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she raised her head slowly, revealing a face that was eerily familiar. "Amelia?" Lucas's voice cracked as he recognized her. But something was wrong. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck in the light. Her lips curled into a twisted smile, and when she spoke, her voice was layered with that same unnatural resonance. "You left us, Lucas." Lucas took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. I don't understand. You're not real. You can't be real." The woman tilted her head, her smile widening. "Oh, we're real, Lucas. And we're not alone." As she spoke, more figures emerged from the shadows, men, women, children, all of them pale and lifeless, their hollow eyes fixed on Lucas. Their movements were stiff, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. Lucas felt his legs buckle beneath him, his mind reeling. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice breaking. The figures didn't answer. Instead, they began to advance, their movements slow but deliberate. Lucas scrambled to his feet, backing away until his back hit the wall. He was trapped, the alley closing in around him. The woman, Amelia, stepped forward, her hand outstretched. "You can't escape, Lucas. This town, it doesn't let anyone leave." The ground beneath them trembled again, the red glow intensifying. The figures closed in, their lifeless faces distorted by the pulsating light. In a desperate bid to escape, Lucas grabbed a loose piece of metal from the ground and swung it wildly, keeping the figures at bay. They didn't flinch, their hollow eyes fixed on him as they moved closer. "Stay back!" Lucas shouted, his voice cracking. The figures stopped, their heads tilting in unison as if responding to an unheard command. The air grew still, the oppressive silence broken only by Lucas's ragged breathing. Then, the woman spoke again, her voice a chilling whisper. "It's not us you should fear, Lucas. It's him." Before Lucas could respond, the ground beneath him gave way. He fell, his scream swallowed by the darkness. When he hit the ground, it was cold and damp, the air thick with the stench of decay. He groaned, pushing himself to his feet, and looked around. He was in the cavern again. The walls pulsed with that same sickly glow, the symbols etched into the surface writhing as if alive. The whispers were louder here, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then he saw him. At the far end of the cavern stood a figure, tall and imposing, shrouded in shadows. Its form was humanoid, but its movements were unnatural, its limbs bending at impossible angles. The figure stepped forward, its eyes glowing with the same eerie light as the symbols on the walls. Its face was featureless, a blank slate that somehow conveyed an overwhelming sense of malice. Lucas backed away, his hands trembling. What are you?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised an arm, and the shadows around it began to writhe and twist, forming long, snake-like tendrils that reached out toward Lucas. He turned to run, but the tendrils were too fast. They wrapped around his legs, pulling him to the ground. He screamed, clawing at the rocky surface, but the tendrils dragged him closer to the figure. As he was pulled toward the shadowy entity, Lucas felt a cold, hollow emptiness seep into his body, as if the very essence of his being was being drained away. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the figure's glowing eyes, burning into his soul. And then, everything went black. Lucas awoke to the sound of dripping water. The air was damp and cold, clinging to his skin like a wet shroud. He blinked, his vision slowly coming into focus. He was lying on a rocky surface, surrounded by jagged stalagmites that reached up like skeletal fingers. The cavern was dimly lit by the faint, eerie glow of the pulsating symbols on the walls. His entire body ached, and his mind reeled as he tried to piece together what had happened. The shadowy figure, the tendrils, the fall, it all felt like a fever dream, but the pain in his chest and the oppressive weight of the air told him otherwise. "Ezra?" Lucas called out, his voice hoarse and trembling. No response. He pushed himself to his feet, wincing as sharp pain shot through his legs. The ground beneath him was slick, the surface uneven. He scanned his surroundings, his heart pounding. The cavern stretched endlessly in all directions, the walls alive with that unnatural light. The whispers were still there, faint but insistent, like 1,000 voices murmuring just out of earshot. Lucas took a tentative step forward, his instincts screaming at him to move, to find a way out of this nightmare. As he walked, he noticed something peculiar. The whispers seemed to grow louder with each step, but they weren't coming from around him. They were coming from within him. His chest tightened, and he clutched at his shirt, his breathing growing ragged. The whispers were speaking his name now, over and over, each repetition laced with malice. "Lucas! Lucas! Lucas! Stop!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the cavern. "Leave me alone." The whispers fell silent. For a moment, the cavern was eerily still. Then, a low rumble echoed through the chamber, like the growl of a waking beast. Lucas froze, his eyes darting around. The ground beneath him trembled, and the symbols on the walls flared brightly, casting long, distorted shadows. "Lucas!" The voice was deep and resonant, cutting through the silence like a blade. It didn't come from the whispers but from somewhere ahead. Lucas turned, his heart sinking as he saw the shadowy figure again, standing at the far end of the cavern. It was taller now, its form more defined. Its face was still blank, but its eyes burned with an intense light that seemed to pierce through Lucas. The tendrils writhed around it like living shadows, their movements hypnotic and unsettling. "What do you want from me?" Lucas demanded, his voice breaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised an arm, pointing a long, twisted finger at him. The symbols on the walls pulsed in time with its movements, their light flickering like a dying flame. "You were chosen," the figure said, its voice a chilling monotone. "Chosen for what?" Lucas shouted, his frustration and fear boiling over. The figure didn't answer. Instead, the ground beneath Lucas split open, revealing a deep chasm. He stumbled backward, barely avoiding the edge. From the chasm came a wave of cold air, carrying with it the stench of decay. Lucas's mind raced. He had to get out of here. He turned and ran, his feet slipping on the slick ground. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic now, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of desperation. "Run, Lucas! Run!" He didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted through the cavern, the shadows twisting and writhing around him. The ground shook violently, cracks spiderwebbing across the surface. The walls seemed to close in, the pulsating symbols burning brighter and hotter. As he ran, he saw something ahead, a faint light, different from the glow of the symbols. It was warm and inviting, a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning as he closed the distance. But as he got closer, the light flickered, and he realized it wasn't what it seemed. It was a doorway, carved into the rock, but it wasn't an escape. Standing in the doorway was Ezra, his face pale and lifeless. His eyes glowed with the same eerie light as the symbols, and his lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Ezra!" Lucas shouted, skidding to a halt. What's happening? What is this place? Ezra tilted his head, his smile widening. You still don't understand, do you? Understand what? This isn't about me, Lucas. It's about you. Lucas shook his head, his mind racing. What are you talking about? I came here to find you. Ezra stepped forward, his movements unnaturally fluid. You didn't come here to find me. You came here because you were drawn to it. To him. Lucas took a step back, his hands trembling. Who is he? Ezra didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand, and the cavern around them began to change. The walls twisted and contorted, the symbols burning brighter. The whispers grew deafening, drowning out all other sounds. Lucas clutched his head, the voices overwhelming him. He fell to his knees, his vision blurring as the world around him dissolved into chaos. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Lucas looked up, his heart pounding. He was no longer in the cavern. He was back in the town, standing in the middle of the empty street. The air was still, the silence oppressive. But something was wrong. The town wasn't the same. The buildings were distorted, their windows dark and empty. The streetlights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows. Lucas. He turned, his breath catching in his throat. Standing behind him was the shadowy figure, its eyes burning like twin suns. You can't escape, it said, its voice a low growl. This is where it begins. Before Lucas could react, the figure lunged at him, and the world plunged into darkness. The world around Lucas dissolved into an inky black void, consuming every trace of light and sound. His breathing was ragged, his heart pounding like a drumbeat in the silence. He stumbled forward, blindly reaching for something, anything, to anchor himself. But there was nothing. Only emptiness. Then, a voice. Lucas. It was Ezra's voice, soft and distant, echoing through the void. Lucas froze, his chest tightening. Ezra? Where are you? His voice cracked as panic began to creep in. The voice didn't respond. Instead, a faint glow emerged in the distance, a soft, flickering light like a candle struggling against the darkness. Lucas hesitated, every instinct telling him to turn and run, but there was nowhere to go. He moved toward the light, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder, biting at his skin. The glow brightened as he approached, revealing a familiar figure standing at the center of the light. It was Ezra. But something was wrong. Ezra's face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were hollow, empty pits that seemed to suck in the surrounding light. He smiled, but it was a twisted, grotesque expression that sent a shiver down Lucas's spine. Lucas, Ezra said, his voice distorted, as if layered with other, darker voices. You've come so far. What's happening? Lucas demanded, his voice trembling. Where are we? What is this place? Ezra tilted his head, his smile widening. This place, it's where it all ends. For you. For me. For all of us. Lucas shook his head, stepping back. No. This isn't real. This can't be real. Oh, it's very real, Ezra said, his tone almost mocking. You just don't understand yet. The ground beneath Lucas began to shift, cracks spiderwebbing across the surface. Shadows poured out from the cracks, writhing and twisting like living things. The whispers returned, louder now, their words unintelligible but filled with malice. Ezra stepped closer, his movements unnaturally fluid. Do you remember the night we found the journal? Do you remember the warning? Lucas's mind raced, fragments of that night flashing before him. The cryptic warnings scrawled in blood, the desperate pleas to stay away. He had dismissed them, brushed them off as the ramblings of a madman. It wasn't a warning, Ezra continued, his voice growing colder. It was an invitation. And we accepted it. Lucas's stomach twisted as the realization hit him. The journal, the symbols, the strange occurrences, they had all been leading to this moment. "We didn't mean to," Lucas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't know." Ezra laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "It doesn't matter. The moment we opened that journal, we sealed our fate." The shadows surged forward, wrapping around Lucas's ankles and pulling him to the ground. He struggled, clawing at the tendrils, but they were unyielding. Ezra watched, his expression unreadable. "This is where it begins, Lucas," he said, his voice soft but menacing. "And it's where it ends." The light around them dimmed, the shadows closing in. Lucas's screams echoed through the void, merging with the whispers until they were indistinguishable. And then, silence. Lucas opened his eyes. He was back in the town, standing in the middle of the empty street. The air was still, the silence oppressive. For a moment, he thought it was over, that he had somehow escaped. But the town wasn't the same. The buildings were distorted, their windows dark and empty. The streetlights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows. And then he saw them. Figures emerging from the darkness, their shapes twisted and unnatural. Their eyes glowed with the same eerie light as the symbols, their faces contorted in expressions of anguish and rage. They surrounded him, their movements slow and deliberate. Lucas's breath caught in his throat as he realized one of them was Ezra. "Lucas," Ezra said, his voice a haunting whisper. "It's your turn now." The figures closed in, their hands reaching for him. Lucas tried to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The shadows wrapped around him, pulling him into their cold embrace. As the darkness consumed him, a single thought echoed in his mind. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As the screen fades to black, a voice softly speaks. "Did you feel the shadows creeping closer? Did the whispers reach you too? If this story sent chills down your spine, don't forget to let us know in the comments. And if you dare, join us next time for another tale of terror. But for now, sleep well, if you can." Mr. Thompson was the kind of teacher who always knew the answer. But what if he knew something darker? What if, behind his calm demeanor and his perfect lessons, he was hiding a secret that would make you question everything you thought you knew? And what if one student discovered it, at the worst possible time? Stick around, because you won't believe what happens next. The first day of the new semester arrived with a cold breeze, a sign of the unpredictable days ahead. Emma stepped into the classroom, her backpack slung over her shoulder, only to find the room filled with whispers. There was something in the air, something more than the usual excitement of a new school year. She glanced around at her classmates, their faces a mix of nervousness and curiosity. Everyone was talking about him, Mr. Thompson, the new teacher. He wasn't much to look at first. Tall, with dark hair neatly combed back and sharp features, he blended in with the crowd at first. But there was something unsettling about his presence. His movements were calculated, deliberate, like he was always in control of the room, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that he was always watching. It was like he knew what you were thinking, even when you didn't speak. As the bell rang, Mr. Thompson walked in, his steps almost silent against the polished floor. The classroom fell silent instantly. He didn't say a word, just stood at the front, his eyes scanning each of them with a cold, unwavering gaze. The air felt heavy, and Emma could feel her heart beat faster, her hands suddenly clammy. "Good afternoon," Mr. Thompson's voice was smooth, almost hypnotic. "I'm Mr. Thompson, your new teacher. I don't need to introduce myself further because you all know what you're here for. You're here to learn." His words hung in the air, and Emma noticed a few students looking at each other, unsure of how to react. He wasn't like the others. There was something different about him. Something dark. He began his lecture, but it wasn't the lesson that drew Emma's attention. It was him. His eyes never left the class, but they seemed to linger longer on her, on certain students. His gaze was penetrating, almost as though he was peering into their souls. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to focus on the lesson. But his stare, those cold, calculating eyes, made it impossible to concentrate. The day dragged on, and every time Emma looked at Mr. Thompson, she saw him watching her. His gaze was unsettling. It wasn't the type of look that a teacher gave a student. It was something more, something predatory. As the bell rang to signal the end of the day, Emma gathered her things, eager to leave. But as she stood up, Mr. Thompson's voice stopped her. Emma, he called her name softly, almost like a whisper. She froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned, trying to hide her unease, but his stare was already fixed on her. "Yes, Mr. Thompson?" she asked, her voice betraying her nervousness. "You didn't finish the reading assignment from last week," he said, his tone calm, almost too calm. "I'd like you to stay after school and complete it. You'll find me in the classroom." A chill ran down Emma's spine. She wanted to refuse, to go home like the others, but there was something in his voice that made her hesitate. She nodded, unable to muster the strength to say no. The school emptied quickly, and soon Emma found herself alone in the hallway, walking toward the classroom. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting an eerie glow. The silence was deafening, each of her footsteps echoing down the empty hall. She tried to shake off the feeling that someone was following her, that someone was watching her from the shadows. But she told herself it was just her imagination. When she reached the door of the classroom, she hesitated before stepping inside. Mr. Thompson was there, standing at the front of the room, as if he had been waiting for her. His gaze was fixed on her, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Come in, Emma," he said, his voice still smooth, but now with a chilling undertone. "You have work to do." She nodded, stepping into the room. The door creaked loudly as it shut behind her, and she instantly felt the temperature drop. She shivered, but tried to ignore it as she walked to the desk he had pointed to. "Sit," he ordered, and his voice was more firm now. Emma obeyed, feeling a strange tension in the air. As she opened her books, she could feel Mr. Thompson's eyes on her, his gaze never wavering. She glanced up, meeting his eyes for a moment, and something in her stomach twisted. There was something wrong about the way he looked at her. It was as if he wasn't just looking at her physically, but at something deeper. Something hidden. Something dangerous. The minutes stretched on, and Emma could barely focus on her work. The silence in the room was oppressive, almost suffocating. She could hear her own breathing, slow and steady, trying to calm the growing unease in her chest. Then, it happened. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, came from behind her. It was a whisper, barely audible. Her heart skipped a beat, and she turned quickly, but there was no one there. She looked back at Mr. Thompson, who was still standing in the same spot, watching her. His eyes glinted in the dim light. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low and cold. Emma's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean?" He took a step toward her, his movements smooth and deliberate. "The whispers. You heard them. You've been hearing them, haven't you, Emma?" Her eyes widened. Her mouth went dry. No, I didn't." Mr. Thompson's smile grew wider, more sinister. "Don't lie to me. I can hear them too. We all can. But you're special, aren't you? You're the one who will understand. You'll be the one who knows what they mean." Emma's pulse quickened. The room felt colder now, the walls closing in around her. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. His presence was overwhelming, suffocating. She felt trapped. "Please. I need to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. But Mr. Thompson didn't let her go. He stepped closer, so close that she could feel the chill of his breath on her skin. "The whispers won't stop, Emma. They'll follow you. They'll always be there. And you'll never be able to run away. Suddenly, the lights above flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel Mr. Thompson standing right next to her, but she couldn't see him. She couldn't hear anything except the sound of her own breath and the whispers, growing louder, all around her. She couldn't escape. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, like shadows closing in on her, and she could almost make out the words. "You're next. Emma. You're next." Her scream echoed in the dark, but no one was there to hear it. Emma's eyes snapped open in the dead of night, her heart racing as she gasped for air. The nightmare had felt so real. The darkness, the whispers, Mr. Thompson's cold stare, it was all still fresh in her mind, like a lingering fog she couldn't shake. She glanced at the clock on her nightstand, 3:03 a.m. Her body was drenched in sweat, and her hands trembled as she clutched the sheets around her. The darkness of her bedroom seemed more oppressive than usual, as if the very walls were closing in on her. She sat up slowly, her mind racing. Was it just a dream? Could it have been? She forced herself to calm down, taking slow, deep breaths. Her thoughts drifted back to Mr. Thompson, the way he'd spoken to her after class, the coldness in his eyes, the whispers that seemed to follow her. No, it wasn't just a dream, she thought. She had heard them. The whispers. They were real. Emma didn't know what to believe anymore. But one thing was certain, she had to go back to school. She had to face Mr. Thompson again. The next day, the school felt different. It was quieter, colder, and even the sun seemed reluctant to shine through the windows. As Emma stepped off the bus, she felt that same unease creeping up her spine. Her hands were still clammy, and she couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching her. Her classmates moved around her, but she felt like an outsider, trapped in her own thoughts, haunted by the memory of the night before. As the bell rang for the first class of the day, Emma made her way to the room. The hallways were oddly empty, the usual buzz of chatter absent. She found herself standing in front of Mr. Thompson's classroom, staring at the door. For a moment, she hesitated. Should she go in? Or should she turn around and run? The door creaked open, and before she could decide, Mr. Thompson's voice cut through the silence. "Emma, come in," he said, his tone smooth, but there was something chilling about it. She walked in, her legs feeling like lead. Mr. Thompson was standing by the blackboard, as usual, his back to her. But there was something different today. The air felt thick with tension, heavy, suffocating. The whispers were back, faint but unmistakable. Emma's skin prickled. "Sit down, Emma," he instructed, not turning to face her. She sat, her eyes nervously scanning the classroom. The room was darker today, the windows sealed shut with heavy blinds. It was like the walls themselves were pressing in. And the whispers, they were louder now, like a chorus of voices calling out to her, beckoning her to listen. She shook her head, trying to clear the thoughts from her mind. Mr. Thompson finally turned to face her, and when he did, there was a look in his eyes, a look that sent a shiver through her bones. His eyes were cold, but there was something behind them, something hidden. Something, waiting. "Did you hear them?" he asked softly, as if they were sharing a secret. "Hear what?" Emma stammered, her mouth dry. The whispers, Mr. Thompson's smile was barely perceptible, his lips curling just enough to make her skin crawl. "You've been hearing them, haven't you, Emma?" Emma opened her mouth to protest, to deny it, but the words caught in her throat. She had heard them. She had heard them all night long, their voices scraping against her thoughts, gnawing at her sanity. But she couldn't tell him that. Not after everything that had happened. Not after the way he had looked at her last time. I didn't hear anything," she managed, her voice trembling. Mr. Thompson's eyes narrowed slightly, as if sizing her up. There was no warmth in his gaze. "Don't lie to me, Emma," he whispered, stepping closer, his voice so soft it almost sounded like a hiss. "You've heard them before. And they've been calling you." Emma stood up quickly, backing away from him, her heart hammering in her chest. This wasn't just some teacher-student moment. This was something else. Something darker. She felt the walls closing in, suffocating her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" Mr. Thompson's lips parted in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't want anything from you, Emma. But you're different. You've been chosen." "Chosen?" Emma repeated, confused and terrified. "Chosen for what?" "You'll understand soon enough," he said, his voice still soft, but there was a cold edge to it now. "The whispers don't stop. They never do. You'll hear them wherever you go. They'll follow you, and they'll always be there, just out of reach, waiting." Emma took a step back, her mind racing. She had to get out of there. She had to leave. I need to go," she said, her voice desperate. Before she could turn to leave, the lights above her flickered, and she felt a sharp chill in the air. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. "She's here. She's the one. She's the one we've been waiting for." The words were clearer now, more distinct, as if they were speaking directly into her mind. She could feel the panic rising in her chest, her breath quickening, her hands trembling. The room seemed to spin around her, the walls pressing in on all sides. Emma's vision blurred as she backed toward the door, her mind reeling. But just before she could reach the handle, Mr. Thompson's voice rang out, loud and sharp. "Don't go, Emma. You've only just begun to understand what's happening here." She grabbed the door handle, twisted it, and fled into the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. But as she ran, she heard something that made her stop cold. A faint voice, barely audible, came from behind her. "We know what you did. We know what you're hiding." Emma's blood ran cold. Who had said that? She spun around, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. The whispers grew louder in her ears, like a maddening chorus. "You can't run, Emma. You can't hide." She bolted toward the exit, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she reached the door, a sudden realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't alone anymore. Something had followed her. The door slammed shut behind Emma with a finality that made her jump. She stood there, frozen, outside the classroom, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Her chest heaved with every ragged breath, her mind racing. What did Mr. Thompson mean by, "You've been chosen"? Why had he said those things to her? And those whispers? She had to admit it now, they weren't just in her head. As she stood there in the dimly lit hallway, the echoes of her footsteps still rang in her ears. The school felt different. It felt like the walls themselves were watching her, listening, waiting. The air was thick with a sense of unease, as though something was lurking just around the corner, ready to pounce. Emma looked around, but the hallway was empty. Her classmates had long gone to their next classes, and the school was eerily silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above, flickering intermittently. She wanted to run. She wanted to escape this nightmare that had begun the moment she set foot in Mr. Thompson's classroom. But she couldn't. Not yet. She had to know more. She had to figure out what was going on, why she was being haunted by these whispers, why she was the one who had been chosen. Her feet carried her down the hallway, almost as if guided by some invisible force. She had no real destination in mind, but somehow, she found herself in front of the school's old, rarely used bathroom at the end of the hall. It was a place she had never really paid much attention to before, old, dingy, and neglected. The faded, out-of-order sign on the door had been there for years. But today, it felt different. Today, the door called to her. A chill ran down her spine as she reached for the handle. She hesitated for just a moment, the whispers growing louder in her mind. "Don't go in there. Don't open the door. It's waiting for you." The voice was her own, but it wasn't. It felt foreign, like something was speaking through her. Still, she gripped the handle and twisted it. The door creaked open slowly, its rusted hinges protesting the movement. The smell of mildew and decay hit her immediately, and the darkness inside seemed to swallow her whole. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, and she stepped inside. The bathroom was worse than she had imagined. The sinks were cracked and covered in grime, the mirrors were streaked with years of dirt, and the flickering light above cast long, eerie shadows. But something about it felt off. The silence was too thick, too heavy, and the air was cold. So cold. Emma moved toward the farthest stall, her feet making a soft squelching sound on the damp floor. She could hear her own breathing, sharp and ragged, but the whispers were quieter now, as if they were waiting, watching her. She reached the stall and pushed the door open, and that's when she saw it. A reflection. At first, she thought it was just the dim lighting playing tricks on her eyes, but as her gaze fixed on the cracked mirror above the sink, she saw it. Her reflection wasn't quite right. Her face seemed distorted. Like it was smiling, but she hadn't smiled. The eyes in the reflection were too wide, too cold. Emma's stomach turned, and she took a step back, her breath hitching. "This isn't happening," she thought. "It can't be real." But it was. The reflection grinned wider now, a sinister, mocking smile. And then it did something that made her blood run cold. The reflection winked at her. Emma stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. She looked around frantically, but the room was still empty. There was no one else there. Just her. And the reflection that wasn't hers. Before she could even think to move, the reflection spoke, its voice low and guttural, distorted, as though it wasn't her voice at all. "We've been waiting for you, Emma. You're not alone anymore." Emma's legs gave out beneath her, and she crumpled to the floor. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, her hands trembling as she scrambled backward, away from the mirror, but no matter how far she moved, the reflection stayed with her, always watching, always grinning. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she desperately shook her head, trying to convince herself this wasn't happening. But the whispers grew louder now, echoing from all around her. "She's the one we've been waiting for, she can't escape us, we're coming for you, Emma." She couldn't take it anymore. She had to get out. She had to leave this place before it consumed her completely. With every ounce of strength she had left, Emma pushed herself up from the floor, her body shaking uncontrollably. She ran toward the door, her breath ragged, her mind in a frenzy. But as her hand grasped the handle, she heard the reflection's voice one last time. "Run if you want, Emma. But you can't escape us." The door slammed shut behind her, but the voice, it stayed with her, like a ghost in her mind, whispering, taunting, waiting. She could feel the cold presence following her, seeping into her skin, into her very soul. As she stumbled into the hallway, her heart thudded painfully in her chest. The school was still silent, but Emma knew she wasn't alone. Not anymore. And she would never be alone again. She had just opened the door to something far worse than she could have ever imagined. The whispers were no longer just in her head. They were real. And they weren't going to stop. Emma's mind was a whirlwind as she stumbled through the hallways of the school. The whispers, the reflection, the voice that still echoed in her mind, everything felt unreal, like she had crossed some boundary, some line that shouldn't have been crossed. But she couldn't escape it. It followed her. The fear, the cold, the unsettling feeling that something was always behind her, watching, waiting. She tried to push the thoughts away, focusing instead on the sound of her footsteps, loud, sharp in the stillness of the hallway. Her heart pounded in her chest, the rhythm erratic as she approached the next turn. The school felt enormous now, every hallway stretching endlessly in front of her, like some labyrinth designed to trap her. The air was thick with something suffocating. It wasn't just the staleness of the old building, it felt heavier, almost suffocating. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking behind her. But the hallway was empty. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. The emptiness felt oppressive, like the school itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Emma's feet carried her forward, almost involuntarily, her body on autopilot. She didn't know where she was going anymore, only that she had to get away from the bathroom, away from the reflection, away from the voice. She rounded another corner, but this time something felt different. There was a door at the end of the hall that she had never noticed before. It was old, its paint chipped and faded, the wood warped with age. A faint, yellow light spilled out from the crack beneath it. She stopped in her tracks, her heart thudding louder as she stared at it. It was strange. The door didn't belong in this part of the school. She was sure of it. But there it was, waiting. Curiosity tugged at her, but so did the fear. What was behind that door? And why had she never seen it before? The whispers in her mind seemed to grow louder, as if they were warning her not to open it. It's too late for you, Emma. You've already opened the door. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts, but the voice wouldn't stop. You've already let it in. Emma took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She knew she had to leave. She had to get out of the school. But something about the door, it felt like it was pulling her toward it. Against her better judgment, she found herself moving closer. Her fingers brushed the doorknob, cold and unyielding, and for a moment, she just stood there, listening. The silence was deafening. Then, just as she was about to turn the knob and open the door, she heard something, a soft scuffling noise from behind her. She froze. Slowly, she turned around, her pulse quickening. But again, there was nothing. Just the empty hallway. Her mind played tricks on her, she was sure of it. She was on edge, paranoid. She had to get herself together. But before she could do anything, the whispers returned. This time, they were clearer, more distinct, and they weren't in her head. They were coming from behind the door. Come closer, Emma. You can't run from it. It's here, waiting for you. Her breath caught in her throat. The voice sounded so familiar. It was the same voice she'd heard in the bathroom. The one that had told her, you can't escape us. Without thinking, Emma twisted the doorknob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was dark, but there was something about the darkness. It wasn't like any darkness she had ever seen before. It wasn't the absence of light. It was something more, something alive. The shadows seemed to stretch and move as if they had a mind of their own. The air was thick, cloying, and it felt like she was stepping into another world entirely. She hesitated for a moment, her foot hovering just over the threshold, but the whispers were too strong. They beckoned her, urged her forward. Come. You're already here. There's no turning back now. Her body moved on its own, the overwhelming force of whatever was in that room pulling her forward, and as soon as she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the walls. Emma's heart leapt into her throat as she spun around, but the door was already gone. She was trapped. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness slowly, and that's when she saw them. The walls were lined with mirrors, old, tarnished, cracked. The reflections weren't quite right. They moved when she didn't, they twisted and contorted in ways that felt unnatural. She couldn't look away, even though every part of her screamed to run. But it was the center of the room that caught her attention. There, in the middle, was a large, ornate chair, its backrest high and imposing. The chair was facing away from her, but she could feel its presence. It was waiting. It was alive. And sitting in it was someone, or something, that she couldn't quite make out in the darkness. Then, the voice spoke again. Emma. It was soft, but it wasn't just the voice she had been hearing. This was different. It was familiar, but it was wrong, like a twisted version of someone she knew. I told you, you're not alone here. Emma's stomach dropped, and she took a step backward, but her feet seemed to move on their own, dragging her closer to the chair, closer to the figure sitting in the dark. She had to know. She had to see what was in that chair. With every step she took, the shadows seemed to grow longer, more menacing. They stretched across the floor, curling up her legs, tugging at her like they were alive. She could feel them, cold and suffocating, wrapping around her like a net. Finally, she was close enough. She reached out a trembling hand toward the back of the chair, her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers brushed against the cold, cracked wood. And then the figure in the chair moved. A cold chill swept through the room, and the shadows shrank back as if afraid. The figure turned slowly, deliberately, and Emma's blood froze in her veins. It was Mr. Thompson. But it wasn't the Mr. Thompson she knew. His face was twisted, distorted, like a mask made of shadows and jagged glass. His eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to draw her in, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque, unnatural smile. "Welcome, Emma. I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice rasping in the silence. Emma's heart raced as the world around her seemed to collapse. The walls closed in. The mirrors grew sharper, the reflections more twisted. The whispers were louder now, louder than ever. And she realized with a sickening clarity that there was no way out. The door had closed behind her for good. Emma's legs felt like jelly, her knees weak as she tried to back away from the chair, but the room refused to let her. It was as though the air itself had thickened, suffocating her, making each breath harder to take. Mr. Thompson's twisted, distorted face grinned at her from the darkness, and the shadows seemed to warp around him, dancing and pulsing like living things. "You shouldn't have come here, Emma," he croaked, his voice a low rasp that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "But now that you're here, there's no turning back." She wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but her body was frozen, locked in place by some unseen force. Her heart hammered in her chest, the rhythmic pounding matching the thundering of her thoughts. She didn't know how she'd ended up in this nightmare, but she knew one thing: it wasn't going to let her leave. "There's always a price to pay," Mr. Thompson whispered, his voice softer now, almost a sigh. "And you've just begun to pay yours." A chill ran down Emma's spine, and her stomach twisted with fear. "What do you want from me?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, thick with dread. Mr. Thompson's grotesque smile grew wider, his eyes narrowing into slits. He didn't answer immediately, instead slowly rising from the chair. The shadows seemed to follow him, lingering like tendrils of smoke, but his presence was overwhelming. The room seemed to shrink with each step he took toward her. She could feel the heat of his gaze, the oppressive weight of his eyes boring into her. He was toying with her, enjoying every second of her terror. He took another step forward, and the shadows seemed to pulse in time with his movements. Emma's pulse raced as she realized, with a sinking feeling, that no matter how fast she ran, no matter how far she tried to escape, he would always be there. Waiting. "The game's only just begun, Emma," he murmured, his voice cold and detached. "And you're the one who's going to play." He stretched out his hand, his fingers unnaturally long, almost skeletal in appearance. It hovered in the air between them, beckoning her. "Come closer," he urged softly. "You can't leave until you play." Emma's heart pounded, her mind screaming at her to run, to get away, but the fear rooted her to the spot. His voice had a power, a pull that felt irresistible. She could see the door now, the faint sliver of light beneath it, but it seemed so far away, too far to reach. What was the game? What was he talking about? Was this all some twisted nightmare? Her legs moved on their own, an involuntary response to his command. She didn't want to move closer, but somehow, she was. Step by step, the shadows seemed to stretch, filling the air around her, drawing her in. She could feel them, thick, cold fingers of darkness that reached out from every corner of the room, clawing at her skin, pulling her in closer. The closer she got, the more oppressive the air became. The shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, and the room itself felt like it was closing in on her. She could barely breathe as she reached the center of the room, and there, standing before her, was the man, the monster, who had once been her teacher. He was different now, something not entirely human, something twisted and wrong. But somehow, she couldn't look away. "Do you understand now?" Mr. Thompson's voice was low, almost comforting, but there was something in it that made Emma's blood run cold. "You've always been a part of this, Emma. You've always been in the game. Now, you just have to play by the rules." Her mind raced. Rules? What rules? What was he talking about? And then she saw it. On the floor beneath her, etched into the wood in strange, jagged lines, was a symbol, an intricate pattern that almost looked like a seal. It was glowing faintly, pulsing with a dark, red light. The edges of it seemed to shift, twisting as if alive. It looked familiar, like something she had seen before, but she couldn't place it. "Not yet." Mr. Thompson smiled again, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. "The game isn't about winning or losing, Emma. It's about survival. And you, my dear, are going to learn that the only way out is to play along." A sudden crash of noise echoed through the room, followed by a shrill, high-pitched laugh that made Emma's blood run cold. It wasn't Mr. Thompson. It was someone, or something, else. The sound came from the corners of the room, from the very shadows themselves. Emma could feel the eyes of unseen creatures watching her, their presence suffocating and terrifying. "You're not alone here," Mr. Thompson whispered, as if reading her thoughts. "They've been waiting, too." In the corner of her vision, Emma saw shapes, dark figures lurking just outside the reach of the light. They moved quickly, their forms flickering in and out of sight. She could hear the sound of scraping, dragging footsteps. Something, or someone, was coming. The game had already begun, and it was getting worse. Mr. Thompson took another step forward, his gaze never leaving her. "The game is simple, Emma," he said, his voice now colder than ever. "You have to face your fears. The shadows will come for you, one by one. You can't escape them. You can't run. You can only survive long enough to make it to the end." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "The end?" she whispered, her voice trembling with dread. "What happens at the end?" Mr. Thompson chuckled softly, the sound low and menacing. "You'll find out soon enough. But for now, let the game begin." And with that, he vanished into the shadows, leaving Emma standing alone in the center of the room. For a moment, everything was silent. The room was still, but the darkness seemed to grow heavier, thicker, wrapping around her like a blanket. The air felt damp and cold, and Emma's heart raced in her chest. She was terrified, but she couldn't look away from the glowing symbol on the floor. And then, without warning, the shadows moved. The first figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, hulking shape, its form twisted and distorted, like something straight out of a nightmare. Its eyes were wide and unblinking, glowing with an unnatural light, and its mouth stretched open in a grotesque grin. Emma's breath hitched in her throat as it moved toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it was being controlled by some unseen force. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows closing in around her. There was no escape. No way out. And the game had just begun. The shadows closed in tighter, pressing against Emma's skin, suffocating her with their cold, unrelenting grip. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she backed away from the grotesque figure that lurked at the edge of her vision. It was too much, too real. The darkness, the game, the twisted monster that had once been her teacher, it was all spiraling out of control. She stumbled backward, her feet dragging across the cold, smooth floor, but the figure followed. always just behind her, a constant presence in the periphery of her vision. It wasn't moving in a straight line. Instead, it flickered, darting in and out of the shadows, like a nightmare trying to trick her into believing she was losing her mind. "You can't outrun it," the voice of Mr. Thompson echoed in her mind. "There's nowhere to hide. It knows where you are." A loud, rasping breath sounded from the darkness, a sound that was more like a growl than a breath. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to get away, but her legs were frozen, rooted in place. The figure was closer now, its head lolling on its neck like a puppet's, its eyes glowing with an eerie light, never blinking. And then, it spoke. "Emma." The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was Mr. Thompson's voice, distorted and warped, barely recognizable. It sent a shockwave of terror through her, her entire body trembling as if she had just been plunged into freezing water. "You can't escape me," it whispered, its voice now low and cold. "Not this time." The room shifted. The walls seemed to bend, warping and twisting in response to the figure's movements. The air was thick, oppressive, like she was trapped inside a nightmare where logic no longer applied. Emma's mind reeled. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But it was. The figure took another step toward her, its movement slow, deliberate. It tilted its head, its grin widening unnaturally, its sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. She could feel its gaze on her, cutting through the fear that wrapped around her heart like chains. There was something else now, something worse than the terror. There was an insidious curiosity building within her, a horrible, gnawing thought that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just some twisted game. "You're part of this now, Emma," the figure rasped, its voice dripping with malice. "You've been here before. You've always been here." She shook her head frantically, trying to reject the words, to deny their truth, but they were too powerful. Too real. She could feel it deep in her gut, that sickening pull toward the darkness that surrounded her. The shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The figure's laugh cut through the air, high-pitched and unnatural, echoing off the walls like 1,000 voices all laughing at once. It made Emma's skin crawl, the sound reverberating through her skull like nails on a chalkboard. "You've been here before, Emma," the figure repeated, its voice now louder, more insistent. "You've always been a part of this. The game, it's been waiting for you." The words hung in the air, chilling Emma to her core. What was it talking about? How could she have been a part of this before? Her memories were foggy, distant, but there was something lurking at the edge of her mind. A memory, a fragment of something that didn't belong. "You never thought you'd come back," the figure continued, its voice growing darker with each syllable. "But you did. And now you will finish what you started." Her head spun, the room tilting around her as the weight of the words settled in. What had she started? What was it talking about? Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet trembled, a deep rumbling sound that vibrated through the room. Emma's breath hitched, panic surging through her as the shadows around her shifted again. They were moving, closing in, surrounding her like a swarm of insects, crawling up her legs, pulling her down. The symbol on the floor beneath her began to glow brighter, pulsing with a red light, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to anything human. The laughter grew louder, more frantic, as the shadows twisted and coiled around Emma's ankles, pulling her down, dragging her closer to the symbol. She could hear the faint whispering voices now, coming from all around her, a chorus of eerie, unintelligible words. She was losing control, losing her grip on reality. Her hands shot out, desperately trying to push the shadows away, but they only grew stronger, thicker. The symbol beneath her feet burned into her skin like a brand, searing with an unbearable heat. She screamed in pain, but the sound was swallowed by the growing darkness. "It's too late, Emma," the figure said, its voice now a twisted echo that reverberated in her mind. "The game has already claimed you." The shadows dragged her to the floor, pulling her toward the center of the symbol. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling her ears with maddening noise. She tried to fight, but the darkness was too strong, too relentless. The air around her grew colder, and Emma could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on her chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her vision blurred, and everything around her seemed to melt away. She was sinking into the abyss, falling deeper and deeper into the heart of the game. And then, as if in slow motion, the shadows released her. She gasped for air, her body trembling with exhaustion, her heart pounding in her chest. "You've made it to the next stage, Emma," the figure's voice whispered, its tone dark and triumphant. "But this is only the beginning." Emma's mind was reeling, the shock of what had just happened leaving her dizzy and disoriented. She couldn't make sense of it, couldn't comprehend the madness that was unfolding around her. But one thing was clear, the game was far from over. And she was stuck in it. Forever. The whispers still echoed in her ears, the shadows still swirling around her like a living nightmare. Emma didn't know how much longer she could take it. How much longer she could endure the game's twisted rules, the relentless terror that seemed to be pulling her deeper into its grasp. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to give up. She wasn't going to let whatever this was claim her. She would survive. She had to. But as she stood there, trembling and broken, she couldn't help but wonder. What if the game was never meant to end? The darkness was heavier now, thicker and more suffocating than before. Emma could feel it, pressing in from all sides like the weight of the entire world collapsing onto her shoulders. The shadows had a life of their own, moving in ways that defied logic, contorting and shifting as if they were alive, watching her every move. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a rotten stench that made her stomach turn. She stumbled forward, her legs weak, her body exhausted from the ordeal. Every part of her screamed to give up, to collapse to the ground and let the darkness take her. But she couldn't. She couldn't give in. Not now. Not when she was so close to the end. She glanced around, searching for any sign of escape, any hint of light in the endless blackness. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive, all-encompassing void that seemed to stretch on forever. Her heart raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she pressed on. And then she saw it. The figure. It was standing at the far end of the room, its silhouette barely visible in the gloom. But Emma knew it was him. The teacher. Mr. Thompson. His face was obscured by shadows, but she could feel his gaze on her, burning through the darkness like 1,000 eyes. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as he slowly stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "You're almost there," he said, his voice low and smooth, like silk sliding over glass. "One more step, Emma. One more and the game will be over." The words sent a chill down her spine. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she couldn't. The terror had a hold on her, wrapping its icy fingers around her throat, choking her words before they could leave her lips. "But you already know the rules, don't you?" he continued, his grin audible in his voice. "You know that the final step is always the hardest." Emma's mind was spinning. What was he talking about? What final step? Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, her pulse pounding in her ears as she tried to piece it all together. She remembered the symbol, the game, the strange sensation that had been gnawing at her from the very beginning. The game wasn't over. It couldn't be. She clenched her fists, her body trembling with a mix of fear and anger. She wasn't going to let him win. She wasn't going to let this twisted nightmare swallow her whole. Not after everything she'd been through. But then the room began to shift. The walls closed in, the floor buckling beneath her feet as the space around her warped and twisted, like she was trapped inside some sick, distorted funhouse. The shadows flickered and danced, growing longer, more menacing, until they were no longer shadows at all, but tendrils of something far darker. Something alive. She stepped back, but the shadows followed her, creeping closer with every breath. The figure, Mr. Thompson, remained in place, his grin widening as the room seemed to contract around her, pushing her closer and closer to the center of the chaos. The laughter, that horrible, shrill laughter, filled the air again, echoing through her mind, bouncing off the walls of her skull. "It's too late, Emma," the figure whispered, his voice a breath against her ear. "You're part of this now. There's no escaping." The shadows curled around her ankles, pulling her down, dragging her toward the center of the room. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift and melt, becoming a dark, viscous liquid that threatened to swallow her whole. She could feel it, the cold grip of the game's final stage, closing around her like a noose. The laughter grew louder, more frantic, as the shadows twisted and churned around her, engulfing her in an inky black abyss. She tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat, choked out by the weight of the darkness. "You wanted to play," Mr. Thompson's voice hissed. "Now you'll play by my rules." She couldn't move. Her body was paralyzed, her limbs frozen by the cold, suffocating grip of the shadows. The room was spinning, the walls warping and bending, and she could hear the whispers again, voices muttering just beyond her reach, their words unintelligible but full of malice. And then, something shifted in the darkness. The floor beneath her feet cracked open, revealing a deep, yawning chasm of darkness, an endless void that seemed to stretch down into infinity. From the abyss, hundreds of tiny, glowing eyes blinked open, watching her with an unblinking, malevolent gaze. The shadows around her grew stronger, thicker, pulling her closer to the chasm's edge. She could feel the pull now, a deep, magnetic force dragging her down into the endless darkness. The whispers grew louder, the voices screaming in her ears, urging her to give in. "No," she screamed, her voice hoarse and desperate. "I won't. I won't." But it didn't matter. The game had already decided her fate. There was no escaping the darkness, no escaping the rules. She was already lost, already claimed by the game. And no matter how hard she fought, no matter how much she screamed, there was nothing she could do to stop it. With a final, horrific scream, Emma was dragged into the abyss, her body disappearing into the swirling darkness, consumed by the void. The chasm closed around her with a sickening snap, and the room fell silent. The figure of Mr. Thompson stood in the center of the room, watching the darkness with cold, calculating eyes. He smiled to himself, the twisted satisfaction of a game well played written all over his face. The game was over, and Emma had lost. But even as the silence settled, a new sound began to fill the air. A whisper. A faint, distant sound, like the fluttering of a moth's wings. It was coming from the darkness. "This isn't over," the voice whispered, the cold, familiar tone unmistakable. Mr. Thompson's grin faltered, a flicker of uncertainty passing through his eyes. The game wasn't over. Not yet. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, Emma's laughter echoed, a dark, twisted sound that sent a chill through the air. Have you ever heard a voice that wasn't supposed to be there? Something that calls your name, from the shadows? Henry thought he was alone. But that night, as the silence wrapped around his poor, forgotten town, he heard it, his name, whispered softly, calling him from deep within the forest. He looked around. No one was there. Yet, the air felt different, heavier. Was it just his mind playing tricks, or was someone, waiting for him in the darkness? What if the forest isn't just a place, but a trap? And what if it's been watching him all this time? Henry had always known something was off in his town. It wasn't just the broken-down buildings or the endless stretch of empty streets. It wasn't even the way the air seemed to carry a sense of stillness, as if nothing ever truly moved here. No, it was something else, something darker that he could never quite put his finger on. He just knew that something here wasn't right. He had grown up in this town. From the time he was a little boy, Henry had been taught to accept things the way they were. There was no escaping the poverty that clung to the land like a disease. No matter how hard his parents worked, it never seemed to be enough. But Henry didn't care much for all that. He had his friends, his books, and his little corner of the world where he could just be. Or so he thought. It was on that quiet evening, with the sun slowly dipping below the horizon, that Henry first heard it. He was sitting on the cracked porch of his run-down house, the worn steps beneath him creaking with every movement. The town was silent, eerily so. There was no hum of conversation from the other houses, no sounds of laughter or footsteps. It was as if the entire town had been swallowed by the weight of its own despair. He stretched his legs out, letting the cool evening breeze brush against his skin, but something tugged at the edge of his mind. Henry. The voice, soft and distant, seemed to float through the air like a wisp of smoke, thin and fragile. It was almost as though the wind itself had whispered his name. Henry froze, his blood running cold. He scanned the empty street, his eyes darting from side to side, but there was no one there. Not a soul in sight. His heart raced. Was it just his imagination? He stood up, the worn wood creaking beneath him as he stepped off the porch. The voice had come from the direction of the forest that bordered the town, the place where no one dared to go after dark. A place filled with stories of disappearances, strange noises, and unsolved mysteries. He had always been told never to go near the forest. It was a place for the lost, a place that didn't welcome the living. But tonight, something felt different. The air was thick with tension, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Henry, the voice came again, clearer this time, but still soft, almost melodic. It wasn't a whisper anymore, it was a command. Without thinking, Henry stepped off the porch and began walking toward the edge of the town. The path to the forest was familiar, one he had walked countless times, but tonight, it felt wrong. The usual quiet had been replaced by an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. His footsteps echoed, unnaturally loud in the empty air. As he approached the forest's edge, the temperature dropped suddenly, sending a chill through his body. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The familiar smell of damp earth and pine needles was replaced by something else, something sour, almost rancid. Henry stopped at the edge, the darkness before him almost impenetrable. He could barely make out the path that led deeper into the woods. His heart pounded in his chest, but his feet betrayed him. He stepped forward, almost as if his body was being pulled by an invisible force. Henry. The voice called again, closer this time. But the sound was distorted, like it was coming from deep within the earth itself. Fear crawled up his spine as he stepped further into the forest, each step heavier than the last. The trees seemed to close in around him, blocking out the last slivers of fading light. The darkness here wasn't like the normal kind, it was thick, like a living thing, and it pressed in on him from all sides. He could hear his breathing, shallow and erratic, but there was something else, something that didn't belong. A faint rustling in the distance, like footsteps, but not quite right. The leaves crunched underfoot, but they weren't moving in any natural pattern. They sounded deliberate. Henry's eyes darted around, but he could see nothing in the pitch-black darkness. He wanted to turn back, to run to the safety of his home, but something held him there, an unseen force keeping him rooted to the spot. The rustling grew louder, closer now. He could feel it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. His heart pounded harder, the beats echoing in his ears. He wasn't alone. He never had been. Henry, the voice whispered again, this time from behind him. He whipped around, but there was no one there. The forest was still. Too still. A cold, clammy sweat broke out on his forehead. He didn't know how much longer he could stand there, but his feet wouldn't move. The voice, it wasn't human. It didn't sound like any person he had ever known. It was deeper, more guttural, as though it came from something ancient, something not meant for this world. Henry turned slowly, eyes scanning the trees, desperate for any sign of what was happening. That's when he saw it, just a flicker, something moving between the trees, too fast for him to catch clearly. But it was there. It was watching him. Then, in the distance, something caught his eye, a figure, barely visible in the shadows. A shape that didn't belong, standing motionless, just beyond the reach of the forest's edge. Henry's breath hitched. He had to know what it was. But as he took a step forward, the figure disappeared, swallowed whole by the darkness. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, sending a chill down his spine. The voice returned, now unmistakable, a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through his bones. "Henry. You should never have come here." A wave of terror crashed over him as he turned to run. But the path he had come down was no longer there. The trees had shifted, their branches twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. The forest had closed in, trapping him. Henry wasn't just lost. He was being hunted. Henry's pulse thundered in his ears as he stumbled back, his feet sliding on the uneven forest floor. The trees closed in around him like a living maze, their twisted branches forming dark silhouettes against the faint moonlight. He was running, but it felt like the forest was chasing him, pushing him deeper into its heart. His breath came in ragged gasps, every inhale burning his lungs as his feet pounded the ground in desperate rhythm. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see something, anything, chasing him, but there was only the cold, oppressive darkness. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, hidden just out of sight, waiting. The voice, that haunting whisper, still lingered in the air. "You should never have come here." The words repeated in his mind, echoing with an unnatural finality. But the worst part wasn't the voice. It was the feeling, the sensation that something unseen was watching him, just beyond his reach. His feet finally stopped moving when he hit something hard. He stumbled into what felt like a tree stump, the impact knocking the breath out of him. He crumpled to the ground, his body refusing to obey him, every muscle screaming in protest. For a moment, he sat there, gasping for air, his hands pressed to his face as if he could block out the reality around him. His heart raced with a terror that made his bones ache. But even as his mind screamed at him to run, to get back to the town, back to safety, he felt an undeniable pull to stay, to understand what was happening. The rustling sound returned. This time it was closer, so close that Henry could feel the breeze on his skin as it moved past him. His head snapped up. Nothing. He listened intently, his heart thumping so loud he was sure it would give him away. The wind had stopped, the rustling ceased, but the forest was still alive, alive in a way that felt wrong, like the very trees were breathing in time with him. Then he saw it. A flash of movement to his left. His head whipped around, eyes straining in the darkness, but all he saw were trees, tall, black, and foreboding. The movement was too quick for him to catch, but there was something there, something alive, and it wasn't human. His mind raced, trying to process what he had seen. It was as if the forest itself had become a living, breathing thing, shifting and changing in ways that defied logic. Suddenly, the whisper returned, louder this time, almost a growl. "You are not welcome here." The ground beneath Henry trembled, just slightly at first, but it was enough to make him freeze. His eyes darted around, searching for the source of the disturbance. Then he saw it, a shadow, rising from the ground like smoke, twisting and undulating. It stretched upward, growing taller, more solid, until it resembled a figure with eyes. Eyes that glowed faintly, burning through the darkness. Henry's breath caught in his throat as the figure began to move. It was slow at first, but its pace quickened, and it began to close the distance between them, dragging its shadow across the forest floor. Henry's pulse quickened again as his instinct screamed at him to run. But he couldn't move. The figure came closer, its form growing clearer. It was no man, no animal, no creature Henry had ever seen. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs long and sinewy, stretching in ways that didn't seem possible. Its skin was a deep, sickly gray, almost as if it had been drained of all life. And the eyes, those burning, unblinking eyes, pierced through the darkness with an unnatural intensity. There was no light to reflect them, they simply glowed, like the embers of a dying fire. It was as if it was made to be the embodiment of everything that Henry feared: darkness, isolation, the unknown. It wasn't just a creature. It was a presence, an ancient force that had been waiting. And it had found him. The figure stopped just in front of him. Henry's body trembled uncontrollably, his limbs heavy, frozen in place by the terror that gripped him. He could feel the figure's gaze on him, studying him, reading him like a book. Every second felt like an eternity, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then it spoke. "Why are you here?" The voice was not the whisper from before. This one was deep, guttural, like it came from the very earth itself. But there was a hint of something else, something almost curious. Henry wanted to scream, to flee, but his throat was dry, his voice lost. His legs felt like they would give out at any moment. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. Its gaze was too intense, too hypnotic. And somehow, despite the paralyzing fear, he felt drawn to it. Drawn to the answer to the question. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure repeated, its voice more sinister now. "This place isn't for people like you. You were warned." A cold sweat drenched Henry's skin. He tried to remember if anyone had ever really warned him. The townspeople often spoke in hushed tones about the forest, about its cursed history. But Henry had never really believed it. To him, it was just another rumor, another tale spun to keep people from exploring the woods. But now, standing here face to face with whatever this thing was, he realized how wrong he had been. It wasn't just the forest that was cursed. It was the town itself. And it wasn't just the people who had been warning him. It was the land, the very soul of the town, that had been waiting for him to stumble into its depths. "What do you want from me?" Henry finally managed to choke out, his voice hoarse. The figure tilted its head, its eyes narrowing. "What do I want?" It laughed then. A low, gravelly laugh that seemed to echo through the trees. It wasn't a laugh of amusement, though. It was a laugh of recognition. As if it knew exactly who Henry was, and exactly why he was here. And then, in the space between breaths, the figure's smile twisted into something darker. Its teeth, sharp, jagged, like broken glass, glinted in the faint light. It leaned in closer, its presence suffocating Henry as he fought for air. "You are the one who has always belonged here," it whispered, its breath cold against Henry's skin. "But you are also the one who will never leave." Before Henry could respond, the figure was gone, vanishing into the darkness as if it had never existed at all. The night around him grew eerily still once more, but the sense of unease lingered in the air, like a weight pressing down on him from all sides. Henry's heart was racing, his legs trembling with the shock of the encounter. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, frozen in place, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone. And he was never going to be alone again. The question was, would he survive long enough to find out why? Henry's feet felt like lead as he slowly made his way through the forest, each step heavier than the last. The air around him was thick with a damp, suffocating cold that seemed to seep into his very bones. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, always just behind his shoulder, ready to strike. The world felt wrong, distorted, as if the forest itself had shifted into something darker, something far more sinister. Every branch that cracked underfoot sent his heart racing, every gust of wind felt like an ominous whisper. The night stretched on endlessly, its silence unbearable. No birds, no insects, just the oppressive stillness that clung to the woods like a thick fog. Henry's thoughts kept returning to the figure, the creature he had seen in the clearing. The image of its glowing eyes, its twisted smile, haunted him. What was it? What did it want from him? The worst part was the voice. It hadn't just spoken to him, it had known him. It had spoken as if it had been waiting for him all along. That feeling, that sense of recognition, sent a chill crawling down his spine every time he thought about it. He couldn't make sense of any of it. The strange feeling that had followed him all his life, the warnings from the townspeople that he had brushed off as superstitions, and now this thing in the forest. Nothing about this made sense. But one thing was clear, he was no longer just a passerby in this town. He had been pulled into something much bigger than himself. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. But one question kept standing out above the rest: why him? His thoughts were interrupted by a rustling noise coming from the underbrush to his left. Henry froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He turned his head slowly, every muscle tense, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Nothing. Just the wind. The rustling stopped as suddenly as it had started, but the air felt thicker now, charged with something ominous. Henry's hand instinctively moved to his side, his fingers grazing the hilt of the knife he'd taken from the town's abandoned supply shed. It wasn't much, but it was something. And right now, he'd take anything that could help him feel less vulnerable. His breath came in short, shallow bursts as he continued through the forest, the trees looming like silent sentinels around him. He knew he couldn't keep walking forever. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening to him, to the town, to the land itself. He needed to find someone who could tell him the truth. As if summoned by his thoughts, a figure appeared up ahead, just out of the corner of his eye. It was a silhouette, barely distinguishable against the darkness of the trees, but Henry's instincts screamed at him to run. He wouldn't, be caught off guard again. His pulse quickened as he stepped cautiously toward the figure. "Is someone there?" Henry called out, his voice trembling in the still night. A deep, gravelly voice answered. "You shouldn't be here, Henry." Henry's breath caught in his throat. The voice, that voice, again. But this time, it was different. This wasn't the creature. This voice was familiar. He strained his eyes to make out the figure in the darkness. As he stepped closer, the figure came into sharper focus. It was a man, tall, gaunt, with sharp features that looked almost too defined, like they had been carved out of stone. His eyes glowed faintly, the same unsettling glow that Henry had seen in the creature's gaze. "Who are you?" Henry asked, his voice hoarse. "What do you want from me?" The man smiled, a thin, hollow smile that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide. "What I want doesn't matter. What matters is that you know the truth." Henry took a step back, his pulse racing again. He was starting to feel like he was caught in some kind of nightmare, one where every turn led to more questions, and every answer only raised more. This man, this thing, was no ordinary person. He could sense it in the air. This man was tied to the dark force that had overtaken the town. And Henry was beginning to understand that he was being pulled deeper into it than he had ever imagined. "What truth?" Henry demanded, his voice growing more desperate. "Tell me what's going on. What is this place? Why is it all so wrong?" The man's smile faded, and his eyes hardened. He stepped closer, his movements deliberate, controlled. "This land, this town, Henry, it's cursed." Henry felt his stomach drop. Cursed. The word rang through his mind, a terrifying echo that settled deep in his chest. He had heard whispers of a curse before, from the townspeople, from the old stories that had been passed down through generations. But this was real. And it wasn't just some old folk tale. Cursed. Henry whispered, his voice cracking. "What does that mean?" The man's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing Henry to the core. "It means you're a part of it now. A part of the curse." Henry's head spun as the words sank in. A part of it. He hadn't just wandered into something dark and dangerous, he had been chosen. But why? Before he could respond, the man's form began to shift, distorting like a mirage, as if the very fabric of reality was bending around him. His body warped, twisted into something monstrous, his limbs elongating in grotesque proportions. The glowing eyes widened, growing larger and more malevolent as the air around Henry grew cold, frigid cold. In an instant, the man was gone. Vanished. Henry stood alone, his body frozen in place as fear gripped him. The night was silent again. But this time, the silence felt worse. It felt heavy, like the weight of what he had just learned was pressing down on him. The truth. The town was cursed. And he was now a part of it. As the realization hit him, the forest seemed to grow darker, the trees pressing in on him like they were alive, like they were closing in. Henry took a shaky step back, his mind racing with what the man had said. He needed to get out of here. He needed to leave. But as he turned to flee, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The eyes. They were watching him again. Not from the trees. Not from the shadows. But from the ground itself. And they were getting closer. Henry's breath was shallow, his chest tightening with panic as the strange glowing eyes, which had appeared in the earth beneath him, seemed to grow larger, closer with each passing second. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs were frozen, unwilling to move, as if the very soil beneath him was holding him captive. The night was alive with a low, guttural hum, like the land itself was whispering ancient secrets that no one should ever hear. The eyes were no longer just distant flickers, they were in the dirt, in the rocks, seeping through the cracks in the ground as though they were embedded deep in the very heart of the earth. And they were watching him. Watching him with an intensity that made every inch of his skin crawl. Henry's body was trembling with an urgency he couldn't explain. His heart pounded in his ears, a constant reminder that he was in immediate danger. But what frightened him more than the eyes, more than the ominous presence in the forest, was the crushing realization that this was no ordinary encounter. The town, the forest, everything, it was all connected. All tied to him in some way. And he couldn't figure out why. "Run," a voice whispered, low and insistent, as if from the very earth itself. It wasn't the man, the creature, from before. This voice was different. Softer. Faint, like a memory trying to push through a fog. The voice was filled with desperation, a warning. But where was it coming from? Henry glanced around, his mind racing. Was it the land itself? Was the curse somehow speaking to him, urging him to flee before it was too late? Before he could answer his own questions, the ground beneath him shifted. A low rumble vibrated through the earth, followed by a deep crack, like a giant's roar. The ground split wide open, and from the black abyss below, a cold, icy mist began to rise, swirling upward in a violent, churning column. He stumbled backward, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding before him. A silhouette rose from the mist, tall and dark, its form shifting as if made of smoke and shadows. The glowing eyes from before, now larger than ever, gleamed through the mist. The figure stepped forward, its movements eerily fluid, as though it wasn't quite bound by the same rules as the world around it. "No, no, no," Henry whispered under his breath, his body shaking uncontrollably. He turned and bolted through the forest, the sound of his feet crunching over the frozen earth the only thing he could focus on. But even as he ran, the growing darkness behind him seemed to stretch out, chasing him, surrounding him. The air turned colder with every step, colder than anything he had ever felt, until it felt as though his lungs were frozen solid. He didn't know how long he ran, minutes. Hours. It didn't matter. The trees blurred around him, the path ahead a winding maze of shadows. And the eyes, they were there again, not from the ground this time, but floating in the air above him, just out of reach. Watching him. Always watching. His breath came in ragged gasps, and the panic surged through his veins, quicker than the cold creeping under his skin. The fear, the dread, the certainty that he was being hunted, it was more than he could take. And then, suddenly, he felt something. A hand. A cold, clammy hand on his shoulder. His body froze, but not out of fear. It was as if the hand had pressed his very soul into stillness, numbing his entire being. He couldn't move. He couldn't scream. He couldn't even think. And then came the voice. Henry. It was a whisper, a rasping sound that seemed to fill the air, surrounding him. The voice seemed familiar, but different at the same time. There was something about it that twisted his stomach into knots. The voice carried a sense of inevitability. You cannot escape this. The hand on his shoulder tightened, pulling him backward, drawing him into the dense shadows of the trees. It was as if the forest itself had come alive and was pulling him toward its heart, toward something dark and ancient. What is this? Henry gasped, his voice shaking as he fought against the invisible force that seemed to drag him toward the depths of the forest. This is your fate, the voice whispered again, barely audible, but so clear it seemed to echo inside his mind. You were always meant to come here. Always meant to see the truth. The shadows closed in on him, pressing against his body, suffocating him. The weight of the air seemed to bear down on him, forcing him to his knees. And in that moment, everything stopped. The forest, the mist, the strange force that had taken hold of him, it all went silent. Then, from the pitch blackness, two more glowing eyes appeared. They were even larger than the others, burning with an intensity that felt like they were digging into his very soul. He didn't need to see them to know what they were. He could feel them, deep inside him, in his chest, in his heart. They were his, and he was theirs. No! Henry screamed, finally finding his voice. He struggled to stand, but the force holding him was too powerful. His legs gave out, and he fell to the ground, his head spinning. The voice spoke again, but this time it was not from the shadows. It was from within him, a whisper so loud that it felt as though it had originated in his very bones. You are a part of this now, Henry. There is no going back. His world tilted. His chest constricted. He felt as though the very earth itself was swallowing him whole. The glowing eyes moved closer, growing ever larger as the shadows closed in. The mist continued to swirl around him, drowning him in its icy cold. But then, as suddenly as it had all begun, the presence withdrew. The weight on his chest lifted. The suffocating darkness receded. Henry gasped for air, his body trembling uncontrollably. He tried to focus, tried to make sense of the nightmare he had just endured, but his mind was reeling. He had seen something in those eyes. Something that was too terrible to comprehend. And then, as if it were all a cruel joke, he heard it again. The voice, soft, almost tender, like a mother soothing a child. You're not alone, Henry, not anymore. With that, everything went quiet. The world around Henry was a blur. The trees, the fog, even the air felt like it was moving against him. He stumbled through the woods, but his legs didn't obey him anymore. His body was a prisoner, dragging him deeper into the forest. It was as though the earth itself was holding him here, refusing to let go. The whispers echoed around him, faint but relentless, curling into his mind like twisted fingers, tightening with every step. He tried to focus on his breathing, but even that was growing shallow and erratic. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, he saw nothing but the thickening darkness, the same black void that seemed to press in on him from all sides. But something had changed. He could feel it. The eyes, those horrifying, glowing eyes, had followed him. They were no longer far off, no longer hidden beneath the earth. They were in the trees now. Watching. He paused, his heart hammering in his chest as the realization struck him. They weren't just watching him, they were all around him. The shadows that had once been his refuge had turned against him. The trees twisted and groaned, as if they, too, were alive, conspiring with the unseen force. A cold gust of wind rushed through the forest, the branches above him creaking ominously. He felt it then, the unmistakable pressure of eyes on his back, the sensation of being observed, of being hunted. He spun around, eyes wide, scanning the blackness for any movement. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes locked onto the shadows that seemed to twitch, almost like they were alive. A figure, no, something, moved through the darkness. It was tall, thin, and barely visible, like a wraith in the night, but the eyes, those damned eyes. They glowed faintly in the distance, watching him with a terrible hunger. "Henry," the voice whispered again, so close this time that it seemed to breathe on his neck. He whipped around, but no one was there. The woods, the silence, everything was closing in on him. He tried to run again, but his legs refused to cooperate. It felt like something was holding him back, pressing down on him, dragging him into the earth itself. The more he struggled, the heavier the air grew, pressing down on his chest like an invisible hand. The whispers grew louder, closer. "You cannot escape," the voice said again, not a whisper this time, but clear as a bell. The air seemed to thicken around him, the weight of the unseen presence making it harder to breathe. Each inhale felt like he was sucking in dirt, his lungs burning with the effort. His legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to the ground, scraping his hands against the cold earth, his heart pounding in his chest. As he lay there, gasping for air, his eyes darted wildly, desperate for anything, anything to give him a glimpse of escape. But there was nothing. Just the dark. And the eyes. Suddenly, the world seemed to shift. The trees around him began to warp, bending and twisting as if they were stretching toward him. The ground beneath him groaned, deep and resonant, like the earth itself was alive and breathing. He could feel it, the pull, the pressure. Something in the forest was trying to claim him, to drag him into the depths of the earth where it had first begun. He tried to push himself up, but his body felt heavy, slow. His hands trembled as he pressed against the ground, attempting to rise, but the weight, this pressure, this overwhelming sense of dread, kept him pinned. He could hear the whispering again, but it wasn't just one voice. There were dozens now, overlapping, indistinct, each one cutting through the silence like a blade. "Henry." His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he froze. There was someone, or something, standing in front of him now, blocking his way. Tall, its shape barely visible in the darkness. Its glowing eyes burned like fiery coals, staring at him with an intense, haunting gaze that sent chills racing down his spine. "What do you want?" Henry gasped, his voice weak, his throat tight. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, the eyes locking onto his every movement, every breath. And then, without warning, the figure stepped forward. Each movement was slow, deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. It moved as though the air itself parted for it. As it grew closer, the ground seemed to tremble, faint vibrations running through the earth, like the very land was alive, watching, waiting. Henry scrambled backward, his legs shaking beneath him. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure, but he couldn't make his body move fast enough to escape it. The eyes were too much, too overpowering. They pulled him in, drew him closer, and with every inch of ground he lost, the figure loomed larger, more oppressive. The wind howled through the trees, picking up speed, whipping at his clothes, his hair. It felt like the entire forest was closing in on him, trapping him, and the figure's eyes burned into him, deeper than any pain he had ever known. A voice broke the silence, cold and unfeeling. "You cannot outrun it," the voice said. "You are already part of it." And just like that, Henry understood. The figure wasn't just part of the forest. It was part of him. Part of his fate. A curse that had been set in motion long before he had ever stepped foot into this town. The forest was calling him home. The figure's glowing eyes grew brighter, and in an instant, Henry felt himself being pulled forward, dragged by an unseen force into the very earth itself. His screams echoed through the forest as he was pulled deeper, deeper into the ground, the cold, suffocating darkness wrapping around him like a vice. He was no longer sure where the earth ended and where the forest began. The boundary between them had blurred, had disappeared. All that was left was the darkness. The eyes. And the endless whispers. "Henry," they said again, but this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was hundreds, thousands. Each one more frantic than the last. He was drowning. Drowning in the whispers, in the suffocating dark. And then, the ground gave way beneath him. The darkness that had swallowed Henry wasn't just cold, it was suffocating. His lungs screamed for air, but no matter how hard he breathed, there was nothing. The ground beneath him felt like wet clay, soft and unyielding, as if he were being pulled into a pit that had no bottom. His body was heavy, every movement felt like a struggle, and the whispers, they were all around him. Henry. They were no longer just whispers, but sharp voices that slithered into his thoughts, wrapping around his mind like invisible chains. "Henry, it's too late. It's always been too late." He wanted to scream, to fight against it, but his mouth wouldn't open. His body refused to obey, his limbs like stones, motionless, immobile. The eyes. He could feel them, even though they weren't visible. He could feel them boring into him, drilling through his skull. Watching, always watching. The pressure in his chest grew tighter, suffocating him, but somehow, he still had the presence of mind to struggle. He clawed at the ground, digging his fingers into the soft, wet earth, desperate to free himself, to escape whatever was holding him. And then, through the chaos of his thoughts, a sound emerged, a low, guttural growl that rattled his bones. Suddenly, everything went still. The wind that had howled through the trees fell silent. The whispers faded. The heavy air around him seemed to pause, as if holding its breath, waiting for something. Henry's heart pounded in his ears, every beat like a drum of dread. He opened his eyes, or tried to. But all he could see was blackness. Not just darkness, but the absence of light altogether. His surroundings were gone. There was no forest, no trees, no ground beneath him. Just an endless, crushing black void. And then, the eyes. They appeared before him, just out of reach, glowing faintly like the embers of a dying fire. Thousands of them, hovering in the space around him, suspended in the air like stars. But these weren't stars. These eyes weren't bright and kind. They were hollow, deep pits of darkness, glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. They knew him. They were him. Henry. The voices whispered again, their tone now familiar, too familiar. A voice he recognized. His own. The realization hit him like a hammer. His eyes widened, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't move. He couldn't escape. The darkness surrounded him, pressing against his skin like it was trying to swallow him whole. The voices, his own voice, twisted, multiplied. It wasn't just one voice speaking anymore. It was many. "Where are you going, Henry? Where have you been?" The words echoed, each one dripping with malice. "Did you really think you could run from me?" The glow of the eyes intensified, and Henry felt something tugging at him, pulling him toward them, toward those hollow pits of darkness. Each step forward was like stepping deeper into a pit, into a world that wasn't real, but yet, it was the only world he knew. The air around him grew colder, heavier, suffocating him with the weight of it all. Suddenly, he was standing. He could feel the earth beneath his feet again, but it wasn't the forest floor anymore. It was hard, smooth, and cold. Stone. Ancient stone, weathered and cracked with age. And around him, the eyes. Thousands of them. "Who are you?" Henry screamed, his voice raw, but even as the words left his mouth, he realized it was pointless. They already knew. "You know who we are, Henry," the voice replied, but this time, it wasn't just one. It was a chorus of voices, his voice, his thoughts, screaming at him from all directions. "You've always known." Henry's legs trembled beneath him, but he forced himself to take a step forward, his eyes locked on the closest pair of glowing orbs. They were everywhere, above, below, around him. No matter where he looked, the eyes never stopped staring, never stopped watching, as if they had always been there. As if they had always been a part of him. And then, like a burst of cold air, the answer came. The truth. It crashed into him like a tidal wave, leaving him breathless, broken. The forest, the whispers, the eyes, the darkness, it had all been him. The guilt, the fear, the torment, it had been festering inside him all along. The town, the cursed land, the shadows, they were a reflection of his own fractured soul. No, Henry whispered, shaking his head, his mind reeling, his heart pounding in his chest. No, that's not true. But the voices only grew louder, more insistent, more powerful. They were inside him now, echoing in his skull, scratching at the corners of his mind. You're one of us. You've always been one of us. His vision blurred as the glow of the eyes grew brighter, more intense. Each one pulled at him, drawing him closer. The cold stone beneath his feet began to crack, and he felt the ground shifting beneath him, as if something ancient and alive was awakening. The pull became stronger, and his legs gave out beneath him, sending him crashing to his knees. His hands pressed against the cold stone, trying to steady himself, but the stone seemed to shift, warping, twisting as though it had a life of its own. His breath quickened, and for the first time, he realized that he wasn't just standing on stone. He was standing on something much darker. Something that had always been there, waiting. You can't escape, the voices taunted. You are already here. He closed his eyes, trying to block them out, but the darkness was everywhere. There was no escaping it now. The eyes. The voices. The weight of it all was crushing him. The world around him was spinning, warping, and he could no longer tell what was real and what was the nightmare. And then, nothing. A complete and total silence. Henry opened his eyes, his heart racing. The eyes were gone. The voices had stopped. But the cold, suffocating dread remained. Henry. The voice whispered again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the darkness. It was coming from inside him. Henry's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. His heart thundered against his ribs, the sound deafening in the silence that surrounded him. His hands were shaking, his legs weak, but he couldn't stop. He had to keep moving. There was no going back now. The ground beneath him had changed again. The smooth stone had crumbled into sharp, jagged rocks, the earth sinking beneath his feet as if trying to drag him into the darkness. Every step he took felt like he was sinking deeper into a nightmare, a place that wasn't just a forest anymore, but something far worse. Something older. The whispers had returned, louder now, more insistent. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, voices from his past, voices that he knew all too well. Henry, it's time. He recoiled. The voice was so familiar, so intimate. It was the voice of his mother, but it wasn't. It was distorted, warped, like an echo from a life he'd long since forgotten. But it wasn't just her voice. It was his father's, his sister's, even his own voice, all of them twisted into a cacophony of sound that made his skin crawl. You thought you could run, didn't you? The voices laughed. You thought you could escape your past, escape the truth. Henry clutched his head, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder, each voice digging deeper into his mind. But he had no choice now. The forest, the town, his entire life, had led him to this moment. He had tried to escape, but the more he ran, the closer it got. The closer they got. He stopped walking, suddenly feeling a cold, suffocating pressure on his chest. The air grew thick, heavy with something he couldn't explain. His body froze, his breath caught in his throat as his eyes scanned the endless void around him. It was everywhere. The eyes. They were back. This time, there was no glow. No eerie light. But they were still there. Watching. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, but the words tumbled out of his mouth before he could stop them. Why me? A low, guttural laugh echoed through the air, the sound vibrating in his bones. You don't remember, do you? The voices whispered. You've always been ours. Always. He looked around, his gaze frantic, but there was nothing. Just the void. The suffocating darkness pressing in from all sides. The eyes. The eyes that never blinked, never moved, never wavered. They were a part of him now. And no matter how much he tried to deny it, he couldn't escape. The ground beneath his feet trembled. He stumbled, nearly falling, and when he looked down, he saw it. A crack. A crack in the stone, running down the center of the earth like a wound. It pulsed with an unnatural energy, glowing faintly in the dark, and Henry felt an urge, a compulsion, to move closer. Don't. It was a warning. A whisper, almost like his own voice, but deeper. The same voice that had spoken to him from the shadows. But he ignored it. With every step closer to the crack, the air grew colder. The whispers became louder. His heart raced. He could feel it now, something was waiting for him at the bottom of that crack. He didn't know what it was. He didn't want to know. But he had to see it. He had to know what was at the end of this nightmare. He knelt beside the crack, his fingers brushing against the cold stone. The sensation shot through his body like an electric current, and the ground beneath him seemed to open up, pulling at his soul. His heart pounded in his ears, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, from deep within the crack, a voice. Henry. It wasn't the voices of his family anymore. It was his own voice, his own tortured cry for help, echoing from the depths of his mind. He recoiled, his hands pressing against his ears as if to block out the sound. But it was too late. The truth was already here. Look at yourself, the voice said, softer now, coaxing. Look at what you've become. Henry opened his eyes, and for the first time, he saw it. The darkness wasn't just around him. It was inside him. Inside his very soul. The crack in the earth widened, the darkness spilling out like smoke. It wrapped around his body, coiling like a serpent, suffocating him, consuming him. He screamed, but no sound came out. His mouth was frozen. His body paralyzed. The darkness closed in around him, thick and suffocating. And then, the truth hit him like a tidal wave. It was never about the forest. It was never about the town, or the curse, or the eyes. It had always been about him. About his choices. His sins. His darkness. The whispers weren't just voices in his head. They were his past. His regrets. His fears. And they were going to drag him down into the void. The ground beneath him cracked open completely, and he felt himself being pulled down, deeper into the abyss. He tried to scream, to fight, but it was useless. His hands were bound. His soul was shackled. There was no escape. You can't run, Henry. You've never been able to run. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the eyes. All of them. Thousands of hollow, empty eyes, watching him as he fell. Watching him as he was swallowed whole. And then, nothing. Imagine being completely alone, surrounded by an endless forest where every step you take only seems to take you deeper into darkness. That's exactly what happened to Sophia. What started as a peaceful retreat turned into a nightmare when the forest itself began whispering her name. The chilling truth. It wasn't just the trees watching her, something much worse was waiting to make her part of its twisted game. What would you do if you couldn't escape the very place you thought would bring you peace? Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Sophia had always prided herself on being logical, nothing spooked her. Ghost stories were nothing more than silly tales meant to entertain, and horror movies were predictable. But the forest had a way of twisting her certainty into doubt. It wasn't until the sun dipped below the horizon that she began to question whether she'd made a huge mistake. The plan was simple, a weekend getaway to reconnect with nature. A break from the chaotic city life, to recharge in the peaceful embrace of the forest. She had found a secluded spot online, tucked away miles from the nearest road. It promised solitude and tranquility. Instead, it brought isolation and something darker. As she walked deeper into the trees, the sounds of the outside world vanished. The hum of cars, the chatter of people, gone. Only the rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call remained. Sophia had heard that forests had a way of swallowing sound, but this felt different. The silence was oppressive, heavy, like it was pressing against her chest, making each breath harder to take. The path was narrow, overgrown with tangled roots that threatened to trip her with every step. She had been walking for what felt like hours, and yet, the forest never seemed to end. It felt as though she was walking in circles, but she couldn't recall seeing the same tree twice. The trees, tall and looming, blocked out the fading light of the day, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch impossibly far. Sophia paused, her heart thudding in her chest. She glanced around, trying to make sense of her surroundings, but the trees looked the same in every direction. She should have turned back hours ago. The thought lingered in the back of her mind, but she dismissed it. She wasn't afraid. She couldn't be. The camp spot she had chosen was near an old stone clearing, surrounded by thick foliage. The air felt cold now, even though it was only late afternoon. She set up her tent, trying to keep her mind occupied. The forest seemed to press in on her, though, its presence palpable. She tried to light a fire, but her hands were shaking. The match wouldn't catch. The wind picked up, causing the branches to sway and creak. A soft rustling sound, like whispers, floated through the air, and she froze, heart skipping a beat. Her mind immediately told her it was just the wind. But deep down, a voice told her it wasn't. Sophia tried to shake the feeling off, telling herself to focus. She needed to calm down. The forest was quiet, yes, but that didn't mean it was haunted. The fire finally sparked to life, its warm glow offering little comfort. She sat down, watching the flames dance, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that she wasn't alone. But then, she heard it again, the whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but there. It sounded like her name. Sophia. She jumped, looking around, but there was no one. Just the trees, their gnarled branches twisting above her. She stood, suddenly restless, scanning the darkening woods. Was it the wind? Or something else? Hello? Her voice came out too loud, too desperate. The words hung in the air like a question that would never be answered. Nothing. A shiver crawled up her spine as she turned back to the fire. The crackling sound of the wood almost felt too loud, too harsh against the growing stillness. She tried to convince herself it was nothing. The forest was just different at night, that's all. Noises carried farther, shadows played tricks. But the whisper came again. This time, clearer. Sophia. Her heart leapt into her throat. It wasn't her imagination. It wasn't the wind. Someone, or something, was out there. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the flashlight from her bag, the beam of light slicing through the darkness in front of her. The trees loomed, black and unyielding, but there was no movement. No one. Yet the whisper continued, faint at first, then louder, closer. Sophia. It was impossible. There was no one else here. She was alone. Wasn't she? Sophia's breath caught in her throat as a sudden, bone-chilling gust of wind blew through the clearing. The fire flickered, threatening to go out, but before it could, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Just beyond the fire's reach, in the shadows between two massive oaks, a figure stood. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, and its shape was barely visible in the gloom. But it was there. Watching her. Sophia. The voice whispered again, this time not from the trees, but from right behind her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she whipped around, but there was nothing, just the flickering light of her fire. But the figure was still there. She could feel its presence in the darkness, closer now, almost tangible. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to escape, but her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the shadowy form that stood just beyond her reach. Who are you? Sophia managed to choke out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, its outline becoming sharper in the dim light. Sophia could see no face, only an empty, featureless void where it should have been. It was as though the figure was a reflection of the forest itself, a dark, terrifying mirror. A whisper came from the trees. You're not alone here, Sophia. Her breath hitched. The forest was speaking to her. Not with words, but with something deeper, more primal. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse, as though it was alive. Before she could react, the figure moved. It didn't walk, no, it glided. And in an instant, it was gone, disappearing into the trees as silently as it had appeared. The whisper lingered. It's just the beginning. Sophia stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The fire was barely a flicker now, the wind whispering through the leaves like the murmurs of 1,000 voices. And the worst part? She knew, deep in her bones, that she had just witnessed something that would never let her leave the forest alive. The whispers had already begun again, louder, closer. Sophia, come back to us. To where? What was in the forest? Why was it calling her? She had no answers. Only the deep, gnawing fear that she would never leave this place. But the voice was relentless. It wasn't just a whisper. It was an invitation. And Sophia, against her better judgment, had already taken the first step into the forest's embrace. And there was no going back. The fire was nearly out now, reduced to a few dying embers flickering weakly in the overwhelming darkness. The wind had shifted, howling through the trees like a living thing, its cold fingers brushing against Sophia's skin. She could hear the whispers again, more insistent this time, rising and falling like a haunting lullaby, circling her, pulling her deeper into a spiral of dread. She tried to breathe, tried to calm herself. It was just her mind playing tricks on her, right? The forest had a way of warping reality. It had to. But even as she convinced herself of this, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The shadow, the figure, whatever it was still out there. Somewhere. Waiting. Her pulse quickened, and she found herself looking over her shoulder, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The air felt thicker now, suffocating. The weight of it pressed against her chest, and each breath became harder to take. She tried to focus, to center herself, but the whispers were too loud. Too close. Sophia, come closer, we've been waiting. The voice wasn't in the wind this time. It came from within her, a thought that wasn't her own, a whisper that felt like it was planted directly inside her mind. Her knees shook as she stood up abruptly, looking frantically around the clearing, but there was no one there. Nothing. She stepped back toward the tent, telling herself she needed to sleep, to escape this creeping madness that seemed to be gnawing at her mind. But before she could even reach the tent flap, a rustle in the underbrush caught her attention. Her heart skipped a beat. Who's there? Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. No answer. The silence that followed was suffocating. But then, another rustle. Closer. The footsteps weren't animal-like, they were slow, deliberate, almost human. Sophia's heart thudded in her chest as she spun around. She aimed the flashlight into the blackness, the beam slicing through the air in sharp arcs, searching for movement. Her breath was ragged as she stepped back again, this time closer to the campfire. The beam of the flashlight caught nothing but trees and shadows. The figure, the voice, it was all in her head, wasn't it? Yet, the fear still had a grip on her, cold and unyielding, tightening around her throat. She felt the weight of it like a physical force, pressing her down. Just then, a figure appeared in the corner of her vision, swift, silent, fleeting. She whipped her head around, but again, nothing. No shape. No movement. Just the stillness of the night. But she knew what she saw. It had been there. Something was watching her. The whispers came again, this time closer. Louder. More insistent. Sophia, you cannot hide. Her mind raced. Her hands trembled as she swung the flashlight wildly, the beam cutting through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. Only trees. Only shadows. But the trees, they seemed different now. More twisted. More alive. The bark looked dark, almost black in the flashlight's beam, as if they were consuming the light, absorbing it. The darkness felt oppressive. Thick, choking. She had to leave. She had to get out. But the moment she took a step toward the path, the same path she had walked earlier, her legs gave way. It was as if something was pulling her back, something heavier than fear itself. Her body refused to move. She screamed, her voice echoing into the emptiness, but there was no reply, no one to hear her. That was when she noticed it. The trees. They weren't where they had been before. They had shifted. The clearing she had been standing in now felt smaller, more confined. The forest was closing in on her. Panic surged through Sophia's veins. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror. Every direction looked the same. The same dark silhouettes of trees. The same oppressive blackness. She tried to run, but her feet stumbled, her legs growing weak under the weight of an invisible force. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Sophia, don't run. The voice was softer now, almost seductive. She froze, her breath hitching in her throat. It had come from behind her. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. She could feel its presence, standing just inches from her back. Whatever it was right there, and it wasn't human. It couldn't be. You think you're scared? The voice was low, a soft rasp that slithered under her skin, crawling through her mind. This is only the beginning. She felt the ground shift beneath her. It wasn't real. None of it was real. It couldn't be. Her mind was playing tricks on her. The trees. The voices. They were all part of her fear, her imagination. But then, the feeling of something brushing against her arm, cold, clammy, was real. It was as though a hand had reached out from the darkness, its fingers lightly grazing her skin. She flinched, stepping away, but there was no one there. Sophia stumbled backward, gasping for air, her mind racing. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it, the thing that was stalking her, moving in the shadows, circling her like a predator. She couldn't escape it. There was no escape. And then, as though the very forest itself had come alive, the trees seemed to move, twisting and bending at unnatural angles. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, pulling her deeper into the heart of the forest. The forest was alive, and it was toying with her. It wasn't the forest that was haunted. It was her. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they were deafening, swirling in her mind. Sophia, you belong to us. The ground shook beneath her feet, and with that, the earth seemed to swallow the rest of the light, plunging her into absolute darkness. Her heart raced. She felt paralyzed, unable to move. The voice whispered again, but this time, she heard the words clearly. Your mind is the key. The forest waits. You cannot leave until you accept its invitation. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as she finally understood the horrifying truth. The forest wasn't just calling her, it was feeding on her fear. It was using her terror to keep her trapped, to keep her from escaping. She was in its grip now, and there was no way out. The silence felt heavier now, pressing down on Sophia's chest, every breath a struggle, every step an effort against the suffocating weight of the forest. The darkness clung to her, thick and suffocating, wrapping around her like a cloak. The forest had become a living thing, its pulse, its whispers, its movement, it was all part of a sinister plan. A plan she couldn't yet comprehend. Sophia's mind raced as she stood there, frozen in place. Her flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that danced in the corners of her vision. Was she losing her mind? Was this real? No, it couldn't be. It was just the forest playing tricks. It had to be. But as she stood, trying to steady her breath, the unmistakable sensation of eyes on her returned. It wasn't just paranoia, it was as if something unseen was watching her every move. She could feel its gaze, cold and calculating, from all directions. And for the first time since entering the forest, she wasn't just afraid of the dark. She was afraid of the very air around her, afraid that the forest itself could reach out and snatch her away, that it could swallow her whole. She took a shaky step forward, hoping to escape, but the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, pulling her into the earth, as if the forest was trying to hold her in place. The path that had seemed so clear earlier was now gone. There were no markers, no familiar trees to guide her. Only the disorienting feeling of being lost, completely, hopelessly lost. The whispers began again, rising from all around her, louder this time, as though the forest itself was trying to speak directly to her. Sophia, you are not alone. Her heart slammed in her chest, and she whipped around, but there was no one there. No movement. No sound except for the rustling of the wind through the branches. Sophia, come to us. You belong with us. The voice, was it male or female, dripped with malice, the words hanging in the air like a taunt. It was a voice that didn't belong to any human being, a voice that made the hairs on her neck stand up. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts, trying to ignore the voice in her head. It couldn't be real. None of it could be real. She was just scared. Just exhausted. But then, she saw it. A figure. A shape, standing at the edge of the clearing. Tall, indistinct, cloaked in shadow. Sophia's heart froze. Her eyes locked onto the silhouette, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move. Didn't speak. It just stood there, watching her. Sophia, it whispered, its voice slipping into her mind like a snake. Come closer. She should run. She should scream, but her legs felt like they were made of stone. The forest was keeping her here. She could feel its grip tightening around her, as if the ground itself was trying to pull her deeper into the earth. But the figure was calling to her. Come to us, it repeated, its voice now a gentle, almost soothing murmur. The forest awaits. Sophia's mind screamed at her to turn around, to run, but her body refused. The figure, it was like it was pulling her in with some invisible force, like it was drawing her closer against her will. And then, like a dream within a nightmare, the figure began to move. Slowly at first, its limbs swaying unnaturally, its movements jerky, almost robotic. The closer it got, the colder the air became. She could feel the temperature drop as though the figure was draining the warmth from the very air around her. Sophia's heart raced as she backed up, but she wasn't fast enough. Before she knew it, the figure was right in front of her, its face hidden by the shadows. Why are you here, Sophia? It asked in that same soft, almost hypnotic voice. She opened her mouth to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The figure was so close now, its presence suffocating, its form shifting in the corner of her vision, as though it didn't want to be seen clearly. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, cold and empty, like two deep wells into which she might fall. I don't know, she whispered, unable to look away from the eyes that seemed to be pulling her in. I just want to leave. The figure let out a soft, mocking laugh, the sound sending chills down Sophia's spine. Leave. You can't leave. You're already a part of this forest. You've been chosen. Sophia's legs shook beneath her as she stumbled back, trying to make sense of the words. Chosen? Chosen for what? No, she gasped. I don't belong here. I'm not one of you. The figure's eyes narrowed, its smile stretching unnaturally wide. Oh, but you are. We've been waiting for you, Sophia. Waiting for you to accept our invitation. Invitation. The word lingered in her mind like a heavy weight. Invitation to what? To stay. To join whatever it was that lurked in the dark corners of this forest. The figure reached out a long, thin arm, its fingers like twisted branches. It seemed to move in slow motion, each step dragging her further into the nightmare. She could feel the air around her growing colder, heavier, as though it was suffocating her. You can't run, it whispered, its voice growing darker, more insistent. You're already here. Sophia turned to flee, but her body refused to obey. It felt as though the very air was locking her in place, like invisible chains were wrapping around her, holding her still. She struggled, her breath ragged, her chest tight with terror. She was trapped. The forest wasn't just trapping her physically, it was trapping her mind, her thoughts, her soul. She couldn't escape it. There was no way out. Not anymore. The figure's laughter echoed in her ears, louder now, filling the empty space around her. It was all she could hear, all she could feel. And then, it was gone. Just like that. The darkness remained, thick and oppressive. The whispers had stopped, but the dread in the air lingered, choking her, suffocating her from the inside out. Sophia blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was she dreaming? Was any of this real? Her eyes searched the shadows, but there was nothing. The figure was gone. The voice was gone. She was alone, again. But she wasn't sure if that was a relief or a curse. The forest was silent now, but the silence felt wrong. It was the silence before a storm. It was the calm before something much worse. The invitation had been made. And now, there was no turning back. The silence in the forest felt like a threat. It pressed in from every direction, suffocating her, urging her to move, to do something, but Sophia could barely gather the strength to even breathe. Every inch of the forest seemed to hold a secret, a promise of something that waited just beyond the edge of her perception. The shadows whispered again, but this time they felt distant, faint, like echoes of something lost. Sophia had hoped that after the figure vanished, the terror would subside. That maybe, just maybe, she could find her way out, escape the nightmare. But as she took a tentative step forward, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The path she had been following, if it could even be called a path, disappeared into a tangle of trees and brush, the darkness swallowing everything in its wake. Her heartbeat quickened as the realization settled in, she was more lost than ever. Am I still dreaming? She whispered to herself, her voice trembling. It didn't feel like a dream, though. It felt too real. Too vivid. The fear. The voices. The cold that seemed to seep into her bones. She had no answers. And for the first time, she didn't want them. Not if they meant the truth was what she feared most. The wind shifted, carrying with it an unnerving scent, decay. Rotting leaves. The smell of something that had been dead for far too long. Sophia's stomach churned, and she forced herself to take another step, though her legs felt like lead. She had no idea where she was going. No idea what was ahead. She only knew that standing still wasn't an option. The whispering voices returned, faint and elusive at first, but they soon grew louder, like a chorus of distant murmurs, each one trying to claw its way into her mind. Sophia. The voice felt familiar, but she couldn't place it. She shook her head, desperate to silence the growing noise in her ears. She was losing her grip on reality, and that was the last thing she could afford to do. But the voices kept coming, wrapping around her thoughts, dragging her deeper into the madness. Come closer. The voice was clearer now. A woman's voice, soft and pleading, but there was something sinister beneath it. Something wrong. Sophia's eyes darted around, looking for the source of the voice, but the forest remained still, as if mocking her. She was surrounded by shadows, shadows that seemed to watch her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Waiting for her to take another step. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A flash of movement. A shape. A figure, no, two figures, standing just beyond the reach of her flashlight, watching her. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, but she couldn't look away. She tried to make sense of what she was seeing, but the shapes were blurry, distorted, like something out of a fever dream. Sophia. The voice came again, closer now, more urgent. The figures moved toward her, their movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring each step they took. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She tried to back away, but her body wouldn't respond. Her feet felt rooted to the ground, as if the earth itself had claimed her, holding her in place. She could hear them now, whispers, low and guttural, coming from the two figures. Their voices seemed to meld with the wind, becoming one with the forest itself, like a chorus of ghosts calling her name. Sophia, come home. The words seemed to echo in her mind, wrapping around her thoughts like vines. The figures drew closer, their forms becoming clearer in the dim light. One of them, a woman, her face obscured by dark, tangled hair, reached out a hand, her fingers long and twisted, covered in what looked like ancient markings. Come, join us. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. The forest was closing in on her, its dark arms wrapping around her, pulling her toward the figures. They were so close now, just a few feet away, their hollow eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel like she was being dissected, like they could see right through her, into her very soul. The woman's lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The smile of something dead. And then, the other figure, taller, cloaked in shadow, spoke. You shouldn't have come. The words were simple, but the weight of them was suffocating. Sophia felt a coldness spread through her, a coldness deeper than the night itself. It felt like the very air around her was turning to ice, freezing her in place, binding her to the spot. No. She stammered, her voice barely audible, choked by fear. You were always meant to be here, the cloaked figure continued, its voice low and distorted. You never left. The woman beside the figure took a step forward, her fingers reaching for Sophia, her touch cold, like ice against her skin. No, Sophia whispered, her voice breaking. This can't be real. This isn't happening. But the woman's touch was real. Her hand gripped Sophia's wrist with an unnatural strength, and she could feel something cold, something ancient, seeping into her. The woman leaned in, her breath cold against Sophia's ear. You were chosen, she murmured. Just like the others. You are one of us now. Sophia's pulse raced as the world around her seemed to shift. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a living thing, pulsating with an energy that felt ancient and alive. The trees, the whispers, the figures, they were all part of it. Part of something much older than she could possibly understand. Join us, the woman's voice echoed in Sophia's mind, the words wrapping around her like chains, pulling her deeper into the madness. The forest is waiting. Sophia could feel her mind slipping. She could feel the edges of her thoughts fading, replaced by an overwhelming urge to let go, to give in to the pull of the forest. The temptation to step into the darkness, to surrender to the call, was so strong. But deep down, somewhere, there was a flicker of resistance. A spark of defiance. I won't. The woman's smile twisted into something darker, something more menacing. You already have. The last thing Sophia saw before everything went black was the woman's face, hollow, empty, and smiling. Sophia's eyes fluttered open, the darkness pressing down on her like a weight. She felt as though she had been asleep for days, her body stiff, her senses dulled, as though time itself had stopped. The air was thick, suffocating, and the silence was unbearable. It felt like the forest had swallowed her whole, and she was now nothing more than a part of it. A whisper in its wind. A shadow among its trees. The cold, clammy sensation of fingers on her wrist returned, sending a jolt of panic through her. She shot up, her breath ragged, her eyes scanning the surroundings. But nothing had changed. The forest was still the same, dark, endless, and hostile. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches swaying as though whispering in a language she could almost understand. She was not alone. Sophia stood, her legs weak beneath her, but she forced herself to move. Her eyes darted around, looking for any sign of the two figures, the woman with the haunting smile and the cloaked figure who had spoken of her being chosen. They were gone. But their presence lingered in the air, thick and suffocating, like a stain on her soul. She could feel their eyes on her, even though they weren't there. And then, she heard it. The faintest whisper, like the rustling of leaves, but this time it was different. The voice was familiar, but colder. More distant. Sophia. The sound of her name sent a shiver down her spine, and her body froze. This wasn't just a whisper. It was a call, an invitation, one that tugged at her insides. An undeniable pull that threatened to drag her back into the forest's depths. She turned, and there, standing just beyond the reach of the moonlight, was the figure of the woman. The same tangled hair. The same empty eyes. But this time, her face was not just distorted by the shadows. It was different. Hollow. Decayed. I didn't want this, Sophia whispered, the words slipping from her mouth before she could stop them. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But her legs refused to obey. The cold air surrounded her, choking her, and the trees seemed to close in, blocking her escape. The woman took a slow step toward her, the ground beneath her feet cracking, splintering, like the forest itself was alive. The figure's smile twisted again, impossibly wide. You never had a choice, she said, her voice soft, almost loving. But it was laced with something darker. Something that resonated deep in Sophia's chest. You were always meant to be here. You are one of us now. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest, but she could barely move. She wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to get away. But her body wouldn't listen. She was trapped. The trees had surrounded her. The path was gone. The forest was no longer just a place. It was alive. And it wanted her. The woman's face seemed to melt, her features blurring and distorting, until she no longer looked like a person at all. She was something else now, something ancient, something that didn't belong to the world Sophia knew. Something that was hungry. You can't escape, the figure hissed, its voice no longer human. It was a chorus of voices, layered with the screams of the lost, the souls that had been swallowed by this place before her. And that's when Sophia understood. The forest was not just a place of trees and shadows. It was a trap. A prison. A living, breathing nightmare that fed on the lost, the broken, the fearful. Those who wandered in, thinking they could leave, would only ever become part of it. It was a cycle that had repeated itself for centuries, each soul feeding the darkness that grew stronger with every passing year. Sophia's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, her chest heaving as the weight of realization crushed her. She was never going to leave. She had never really left. The forest had taken her, and it would never let her go. She could feel it now, the pull, the dark force that had been watching her from the moment she stepped into this place. The trees creaked as if in agreement, their branches stretching toward her, as if beckoning her to join them. The forest had been waiting. And now, it had claimed her. "Help me," she begged, her voice breaking as tears welled in her eyes. "Please, let me go." The woman's laughter echoed, hollow and mocking, as she knelt beside Sophia. Her face, now grotesque and decayed, hovered just inches from Sophia's, her cold breath washing over her skin. "There is no help here," she whispered. "You are home now." Sophia's body trembled as the darkness closed in around her. The forest seemed to pulse, as though it was alive, feeding off her fear, growing stronger with every passing second. The trees reached down, their branches like twisted fingers, and as Sophia's vision blurred, she realized something chilling. She wasn't just surrounded by trees. The forest was changing. The trees were shifting, rearranging themselves into shapes, into faces. Hundreds of eyes blinked open in the bark of the trees, watching her, waiting. A symphony of whispers filled the air, their voices melding into one, indistinguishable from each other. And then it hit her. The forest wasn't just a place of death. It was a place of rebirth. A place where the lost souls came to live on, twisted and broken. Sophia wasn't just trapped here. She had become part of it. She had become the forest. The shadows closed in, and the last thing Sophia heard was her own scream, swallowed by the dark. As the screen fades to black, the faint whisper of Sophia's voice can still be heard, calling for help.